stable door had not been latched properly. Dale Harmon noticed it the moment he stepped off the porch into the dark, the cold morning air hitting his face like a wall. He had been ranching on this land for 37 years, and in all that time, a loose latch before sunrise meant one thing: something was wrong. He pulled his coat tighter and crossed the frozen ground quickly, his boots crunching through the thin layer of ice that had settled over the mud during the night. The sky above the Montana hills was still black except for a thin gray line at the far edge of the east, where the sun had not yet decided to show itself. It was Thanksgiving morning. It was also the coldest night the region had seen in 14 years. He pushed the stable door open slowly, not from caution but from habit. The horses startled easily in cold weather, and a sudden noise in the dark could cause one of them to kick a wall hard enough to split a plank. The two horses, a roan mare named Copper and an older gray gelding called Abe, both turned their heads toward him from their stalls. Their breath came in thick clouds. The hay on the ground was disturbed in a way that Dale did not immediately understand. He reached for the lantern he kept on a hook just inside the door, struck a match, and held the flame to the wick. That was when he saw her. She was lying in the corner of the far stall, pressed against the wooden wall with her back to him, wrapped in the old brown horse blanket that Dale normally kept folded on the top rail. 3 children were tucked against her, the smallest one folded into her chest like something fragile being held together by will alone. They were all asleep. The woman's shoes were thin canvas sneakers, completely wrong for the weather, soaked through and dark at the toes. One of the children, a boy who looked about 6, had no socks on his feet. His small ankles were pressed against his mother's legs, and she had pulled the edge of the blanket down over them even while sleeping, even in the dark, even in the cold. Dale stood very still for a long time. He was not a man who panicked. He had delivered calves alone in blizzards, had pulled a hand out from under a tractor, had sat beside his father's bed in the final hours without anyone else in the house. He had learned over many decades that the first thing a person should do when something unexpected happens is simply to breathe and look carefully before doing anything else. So he breathed, and he looked carefully. The woman had dark hair that was tangled and loose across her shoulder. He was young, younger than he had expected, somewhere in her early 30s. Her face, even in sleep, carried a tension around the mouth and brow that comes from days of worrying without rest. The children ranged in age from very small to what he guessed was 9 or 10 years old. The oldest one, a girl, had her arms stretched across the younger two as though she had been trying to protect them even while unconscious. Copper made a low sound from her stall. One of the children stirred briefly, then settled again. Dale turned and walked back out into the cold, pulling the stable door almost closed behind him. He stood on the frozen ground for a moment looking up at the dark sky, then walked back toward the house. Inside the kitchen, Margaret was already awake, standing at the counter in her robe, the coffee percolating on the stove, filling the room with the smell of something warm and ordinary. She looked at his face and set down the mug she was holding. "What is it?" she said. "There's a woman in the stable," Dale said, "with children, 3 of them. They're sleeping." Margaret did not say anything for a moment. She looked at him steadily, with the kind of calm that a long marriage produces in people who have faced things together. "How old are the children?" she said. "Young," Dale said. "The smallest one can't be more than 4. Margaret was already moving toward the stove. She lifted the coffee pot and then opened the cabinet above the counter and took out the large tin tray that they used for carrying things out to the hands during harvest. She set it on the counter. She poured coffee into 2 mugs, and then opened the refrigerator and took out the milk and poured it into a small saucepan and set it on the burner. She moved with the quiet purpose of someone who has already decided what needs to be done. "Are they all right?" she said. "They were sleeping," Dale said. "The little one's feet were cold." Margaret nodded once. She went to the bread box and took out the biscuits left from the night before and arranged them on a plate. Then she added a jar of jam and 2 spoons. She warmed the milk slowly over low heat, stirring it without looking down, her eyes somewhere in the middle distance. When the milk was warm, she poured it into the thermos they used for field work and sealed the lid. She loaded everything onto the tray. Dale held the kitchen door open for her. They walked together across the frozen ground toward the stable, their breath rising in clouds around them. The sky was beginning to lighten almost imperceptibly at the edges. A bird called from somewhere in the dark tree line once, then went silent. Margaret carried the tray without speaking. Dale walked beside her, slightly ahead, watching the stable door. He pushed it open gently and held the lantern up. The woman had not moved. The children were still asleep. Margaret set the tray down on the stable workbench and turned to look at the family in the corner. She did not make a sound. She simply stood and looked for a moment, and then she did something that Dale had not expected. She walked to the wall hook beside the horse equipment and took down the second blanket. the heavier wool one that they kept for the coldest nights, and she walked over to the stall entrance and carefully, without waking anyone, draped it over the children's legs. The woman's eyes opened. They were dark brown and fully alert the instant they opened, which told Dale something important. This was not a person who slept deeply or safely. This was someone who had learned to come awake fast. The woman sat up immediately, pulling the children closer with both arms, her eyes moving from Dale to Margaret and back again, her breathing quick and shallow. "It is all right," Margaret said, and her voice was exactly the right kind of quiet, not soft the way people speak to someone they feel sorry for, but calm the way people speak when they mean every word. "You are safe here. Nobody is angry. We brought you something warm." The woman stared at her. Her jaw was tight. "My name is Margaret Harmon," Margaret said. "This is my husband Dale. This is our land, and you are welcome to stay right there until you're ready to get up." The woman looked at the tray on the workbench. She looked at the children against her. The oldest girl was awake now too, watching Margaret with wide, careful eyes. The boy was still sleeping. The youngest, the small one Dale had noticed first, had her face buried against her mother's arm. "I did not want to bother anyone," the woman said. Her English was careful and slightly formal, the kind that comes from learning a language in school rather than on the street. Her voice was low and controlled. "The door was not locked. I did not break anything. We were only going to stay until the morning." "I know," Margaret said. She picked up one of the coffee mugs and carried it over to the stall entrance and held it out. "Drink this. It'll warm you." The woman looked at the mug for a moment. Then she reached out and took it. Her name was Rosa Mendez. She told them that much before she told them anything else, because it seemed to matter to her that they know her name, that she was not just a stranger who had come in out of the cold without asking. She was Rosa Mendez, and she was a person, and she wanted them to know it. She was 31 years old. She had been driving since the afternoon of the day before, coming north from Arizona on a route she had mapped out on her phone before the phone had died somewhere around the Wyoming border. The minivan, a 2009 model with faded paint and a crack running across the rear windshield, was parked at the edge of Dale's gravel drive with a flat tire on the front right side. She had driven the last several miles on the rim without knowing it, too focused on the road ahead to notice the change in the vehicle's handling, until she had turned off the highway and felt the grinding under her feet. She had not wanted to stop on the highway in the dark with 3 children. She had turned onto the first road she saw, and followed it until she found a building with no lights on, meaning no one would see her, and a door that was not locked, meaning she and her children would not have to sleep in the van in the cold. She said all of this plainly, without asking for sympathy, in the same careful English she had used from the beginning. She drank the coffee. The children were awake now, all 3 of them, sitting quietly around her, with the awareness that children develop when they have spent time in uncertain situations. They watched the adults and they waited. Rosa's oldest child was a girl named Clara, age 9. Her middle child was a boy named Luis, age 6. The youngest was a girl she called B, short for Beatrice, who was 4 years old, and who had fallen asleep again against her mother's shoulder before Rosa had finished her second sentence. "How long have you been driving?" Dale said. It was the first thing he had said since they came back to the stable. Rosa looked at him. "Since 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon," she said. "Where were you going?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. She looked down at the mug in her hands. "North," she said finally. "I was told there was work up here. Ranch work, farm work. I know that kind of work." She paused. "I grew up on a farm." Dale looked at Margaret. Margaret was looking at Rosa. "Are you hungry?" Margaret said. Rosa said nothing. But Clara, who was 9 and had clearly inherited her mother's wariness along with her mother's eyes, nodded once. A tiny, almost invisible movement, before her mother could stop her. Margaret picked up the plate of biscuits and carried it into the stall. What happened next was not dramatic. There were no tears, no speeches, no big gestures. Margaret sat on an overturned bucket and handed biscuits to children who ate them with a seriousness that was difficult to watch. Dale stood near the door and looked at the horses. Copper had come to the front of her stall and was watching the proceedings with great interest. Abe had gone back to his hay. Rosa ate slowly, the way people eat when they are trying not to look hungry. She broke a biscuit in half and gave the larger half to Luis. She spread jam on a piece for Bay without being asked, knowing the child's preference by instinct. She ate the smallest portion herself and held her coffee mug with both hands long after it was empty, as though the warmth of it was still worth holding on to. The sky outside was fully gray now, approaching the pale gold of early sunrise. Somewhere in the barn beyond the stable, a rooster announced the morning in the careless way roosters do, loudly, without any consideration for the occasion. "Come inside," Margaret said. "All of you." Rosa looked at her. "We don't want to impose," she said. "You're not imposing," Margaret said. "It's Thanksgiving, and it's cold, and those children need a proper breakfast." She stood up from the bucket and dusted off her robe and picked up the tray. "Come inside." Rosa looked at Dale. Dale had already turned toward the door. "I'll carry the little one," he said, not waiting for permission. He walked into the stall, reached down, and picked up Bea with the practiced ease of a man who had spent decades carrying things that needed carrying. The child stirred, looked up at his face with dark, drowsy eyes, and then simply put her head against his shoulder and went back to sleep. Rosa watched this. Something moved across her face. A complicated thing that was not quite relief and not quite grief, but something in between. Some emotion that didn't have a simple name. She got to her feet. She smoothed Clara's hair back from her face with one hand. She reached out and took Luis's hand. They walked out of the stable and across the frozen ground toward the house, single file, in the cold morning air. The sun was beginning to appear now over the far ridge, pale and honest, lighting everything without warmth yet, but at least with the promise of it. The horses watched them go through the stable window. The rooster in the barn crowed again, equally unconcerned. Margaret held the kitchen door open. Dale carried Bea through it first. Rosa came in last, stepping over the threshold into the warmth and the smell of coffee, and the ordinary miracle of a house that had heat. She stood just inside the door for a moment and looked at the kitchen. The wooden table, the stove, the curtains on the window, the row of boots by the door, the coffee cups on their hooks. All of it so normal, all of it so far from where she had been the night before. "Sit down," Margaret said from the stove. "Sit anywhere. The children can sit anywhere." Rosa pulled out a chair at the table. Clara sat beside her immediately. Luis climbed up into the chair across from them and looked around the kitchen with the bright, unembarrassed curiosity of a 6-year-old boy who has decided that this place seems safe enough to be interested in. Dale settled Bea into the armchair by the window, tucking one of Margaret's throw blankets around her small sleeping form. He stood there for a moment looking at her, one hand resting on the back of the chair. Then he walked to the stove and poured himself a coffee and sat down at the head of the table. No one said anything for a moment. The coffee percolated. The morning light came through the window. Outside, the frozen fields of the Harmon Ranch stretched out in every direction, white and silent and very still. "Thank you," Rosa said quietly. "Don't thank us yet," Dale said, not unkindly. "Margaret hasn't cooked yet." It was, for him, a long speech. Margaret glanced back at him from the stove with one eyebrow slightly raised. Clara looked at her mother. Luis laughed, a short, surprised sound, and then covered his mouth with both hands as if he had not intended to do it. Rosa looked at Luis. Then, for the first time since she had opened her eyes in the cold stable an hour before, the tension around her mouth eased just slightly, and she almost smiled. The morning continued. The sun climbed, the kitchen filled with the smell of eggs and bacon and fresh coffee and warm bread. Outside, the Montana hills turned from gray to pale gold to white where the snow still clung to the higher ground. It was Thanksgiving morning, and in the Harmon kitchen, something that had no name yet was just beginning to take shape. Something quiet and careful, and not fully understood by anyone in the room, least of all by Rosa Mendez, who had come looking for nothing more than a place to be warm until the morning, and had instead found herself sitting at a table set by strangers who were, without knowing it yet, on the verge of becoming something else entirely. By the time Margaret set a full plate of eggs and toast in front of Clara, the girl had stopped watching the kitchen door every 30 seconds. That was the first sign. Children who have been uncertain for a long time develop a habit of watching exits, not because they plan to leave, but because they need to know they could if they had to. Clara had been doing it since the moment they walked in from the stable, her eyes moving quietly to the kitchen door, then to the hallway door, then to the window, and back again. She did it without thinking about it, the way a person blinks. But somewhere between the first cup of warm milk and the moment Margaret put that plate down in front of her, the habit paused. Clara looked at the eggs. She looked at the toast. She picked up the fork. Rosa noticed. Rosa always noticed things about her children that other people missed, because she had spent the last several months in the kind of constant state of attention that a parent in a difficult situation learns to sustain. It was exhausting. It was also, in a strange way, something she had grown used to, this permanent low hum of awareness in the back of her mind that monitored each child the way a pilot monitors instruments, always checking, always adjusting. When Clara's eyes stopped going to the door, Rosa felt the change before she fully understood it. She exhaled, a slow, quiet breath that she had not known she was holding. Bea was still asleep in the armchair by the window, tucked under the blanket Dale had wrapped around her. She had not stirred since he put her there. The morning light coming through the window touched her face softly, and she looked, in that moment, like any sleeping child on any ordinary morning. Safe, warm, unknowing. Rosa looked at her for a moment. Then she looked back at her plate and picked up her own fork. Luis had eaten half his breakfast and was now asking Dale about the horses. This was a development that Rosa had not anticipated. Luis was not a shy child, but he had learned, in recent months, to be careful about when he spoke to strangers. He had learned to read the mood of a room before he opened his mouth, to check his mother's face before he asked a question. But something about Dale, the quietness of him perhaps, or the size of him, or simply the fact that he had carried B inside without making a fuss about it, had put Luis at ease in a way that few adults managed. Luis had asked 3 questions about horses in the span of 5 minutes, and Dale had answered each one in 3 words or fewer, and somehow this had only encouraged the boy to ask more. "Does the big one have a name?" Luis said. "Copper," Dale said. "Is she mean?" "No." "Can I touch her?" Dale looked at him. "After breakfast," he said. Luis went back to eating with a focus that had not been present before the promise was made. Rosa watched this exchange. She wanted to tell Luis not to bother the man, to eat his food and be quiet, to not ask for things from people who had already given enough. But she stopped herself. She stopped herself because she recognized something in Dale's voice, not warmth exactly, but something adjacent to it, a willingness. The kind of willingness that some people have and others don't, that cannot be taught or performed, that either lives in a person or it doesn't. She had met enough people in her life to know the difference between someone who was tolerating a child's questions and someone who was, in their own quiet way, fine with them. Dale was fine with it. She let Luis talk. Margaret moved around the kitchen with the easy rhythm of a woman who had been cooking in that space for many years, who knew without looking where every pot was, where the spare spatula lived, which burner ran hot, and which one needed to be turned up a little past where it seemed like it should be. She refilled coffee mugs without asking. She brought a second piece of toast for Clara without being told the girl had eaten the first one. She did all of this without any performance of generosity, which Rosa had noticed was the kind of generosity that was hardest to accept, because it gave you nothing to push back against. "Where are you headed?" Margaret asked, not looking up from the stove. Her tone was the same tone she might use to ask someone what kind of eggs they preferred, easy and without pressure. Rosa wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. "I had heard there were ranches in this part of Montana that sometimes hire seasonal workers," she said. "I have experience with animals. I grew up on a farm in Sonora. I know cattle, I know horses, I know the kind of early morning work that most people don't want to do." She paused. "I was going to start looking after the holiday." Margaret turned to look at her then, just briefly. "Where were you planning to stay in the meantime?" she said. Rosa didn't answer immediately. The silence was its own answer. Margaret nodded, as if Rosa had said something perfectly reasonable. She turned back to the stove. "Well," she said, "no one's going anywhere today. It's Thanksgiving, and Dale's children are coming for dinner, and there's more food in this house than we could possibly eat between the 2 of us." She adjusted the burner under a pot without looking away from it. "So that's today taken care of." Rosa opened her mouth, closed it again. "The children can play in the yard after breakfast," Margaret continued, "as long as they have coats. Are there coats in the van?" "Yes," Rosa said quietly. "Good." Margaret moved the pot to a different burner. "Dale will fix your tire this morning. He has everything he needs in the equipment shed." Dale, who had been listening to Luis explain his theory about whether horses could understand human speech, looked over at Rosa. "What size?" he said. "I don't know," Rosa said. She looked slightly stunned, the way people look when things are being decided around them faster than they can object. "I can go look." "I'll look," Dale said. He pushed back from the table and stood up and took his coat from the hook by the door. "Finish eating," he said, directing this at no one in particular, though the instructions seemed to apply to everyone. He went out. The kitchen door closed behind him. Rosa stared at the place where he had been sitting. "He's not a man who says much," Margaret said, from the stove. "But he does what he says, every time without fail. 39 years of marriage, and I have never once heard him promise something he didn't deliver." She poured herself a small cup of coffee and stood leaning against the counter. "It took me about 6 months to understand that about him. After that, I stopped needing the words." Rosa looked at her. "How long have you been here?" she said. "On this ranch?" 37 years, Margaret said. "We built the main barn ourselves, Dale and I and his father. I was 24 years old and I had never held a hammer in my life, and by the time the barn was up I could frame a wall as well as any carpenter in the county." She smiled at the memory, briefly. "You learn what you need to learn when there's work in front of you." Clara had finished eating. She was sitting very straight in her chair, watching Margaret with the attentive eyes of a girl who was filing things away, storing information, the way bright children do when they are in an unfamiliar place and trying to understand the rules. "What is your name?" Clara said. "Margaret," she said. "Is this your house?" Clara said. "It is." Clara considered this. "It smells like a real house," she said. Margaret looked at her. "What does a real house smell like?" Clara thought about it seriously. "Like something cooking," she said. "And like wood. And like people who live there all the time." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "That's a very good description," she said. Rosa was looking at Clara with an expression that was hard to define. There was pride in it. There was also something that looked like pain, quick and quiet, there and gone. She reached across the table and straightened the collar of Clara's shirt, a small, automatic gesture. "Can I be excused?" Luis said. He had eaten every crumb on his plate. "Say thank you first," Rosa said. "Thank you," Luis said, directed at Margaret, with the formal sincerity of a 6-year-old who has been taught manners and means them. Then he looked at Rosa. "Can I go see if the man needs help with the tire?" Rosa started to say no. Then she stopped. She thought about Dale, who was quiet and did what he said and had carried Bea inside without making a production of it. She thought about Luis, who had been cooped up in a van for most of a day and needed to move, needed something to do with his hands, needed to feel useful in the way that boys of 6 sometimes urgently need to feel. "Don't be in his way," she said. "I won't," Luis said, and he was off the chair and out the kitchen door before Rosa could add anything else. Margaret watched him go with an expression that was halfway to fond. "He'll be fine," she said. "Dale's patient with children. He was patient with our 3, and they were a handful." "How many children do you have?" Rosa said. 3, Margaret said. 2 sons and a daughter. They're all coming today for dinner. The daughter, her name is June. She'll be here by noon. The older boy, Nathan, drives up from Billings, so probably 1 o'clock. The younger boy, Greg, he lives in town, so he'll be last. He always finds something to be late for. She said this with the comfortable exasperation of a mother who has made peace with a grown child's habits. "There will be a lot of people in this house by this afternoon." Rosa looked slightly overwhelmed by this information. "We don't have to stay for dinner," she said carefully. "You have been very kind already. We can—" "You can sit at our table," Margaret said. And her voice was not unkind, but it was firm, in the way that generous people's voices get when they have offered something real and do not want to argue about it. "That's what you can do. Now, is there anything the children can't eat? Any allergies I should know about?" Rosa opened her mouth, closed it. She was a woman who had learned, through necessity, how to accept help when it was offered without conditions. But the learning had been hard, and it was not complete. There was still a part of her that wanted to refuse, to insist, to preserve some boundary between herself and kindness that came too easily. Because in her experience, things that came easily often had a price that showed itself later. But Margaret Harmon was not looking at her with the expression of someone who wanted anything back. She was looking at her the way a person looks at a practical problem they have decided to solve. "Luis doesn't eat onions," Rosa said. "He never has. He can smell them in anything." Margaret nodded. "I'll make his portion separately." Bea chose that moment to wake up. She did it the way very small children wake from deep sleep, sudden, complete, sitting upright in the armchair with her eyes wide open and her hair pushed to one side, looking around the room with the urgent bewilderment of someone who needs several seconds to remember where they are. Her gaze found Rosa. Immediately, her face arranged itself into the particular expression of a 4-year-old who is trying to decide whether to cry. "Come here, my love," Rosa said in Spanish. A reflex, the language of comfort, the language she reached for without thinking when one of her children needed her. Bea climbed out of the armchair, trailing the blanket behind her, and crossed the kitchen on unsteady just-woken legs, and climbed into her mother's lap and put both arms around Rosa's neck and tucked her face against her shoulder. Rosa held her. She pressed her lips to the top of Bea's hair. She closed her eyes briefly. Margaret had turned back to the stove. She made no comment about this, which was, of all the things she had done that morning, perhaps the most considerate. Outside, through the kitchen window, Rosa could see Dale and Luis crouched beside the front wheel of her van. Dale was showing the boy something, a tire iron perhaps, or the valve on the spare, and Luis was nodding with the deep seriousness of a child being shown how something works. The morning sun was full now, lighting the gravel drive and the bare trees at the edge of the property, making everything look cleaner and sharper than it actually was, the way winter sun does on clear mornings. Rosa watched them for a moment. Then she looked around the kitchen one more time, at Clara drawing something quietly on a paper Margaret had given her, at Bea half asleep again against her shoulder, at the steam rising from the pot on the stove. at the worn wooden table that had seen 37 years of meals. She had spent the last several months moving towards something she could not quite see or name. She had followed the idea of North, the way people sometimes follow an idea when they have nothing more concrete to follow. She had not known what she was looking for. She was not sure she knew now. But she was warm, and her children were warm, and the man outside was teaching her son how tires worked, and the woman at the stove was cooking a Thanksgiving dinner big enough for everyone, and the morning was continuing forward the way mornings do. Steady, unremarkable, full of small and ordinary things. That was, Rosa thought, more than enough. That was, for right now, everything. After breakfast was cleared and the dishes were done, an activity that Rosa insisted on contributing to despite Margaret's protests, Dale did exactly what he had said he would do, and took Luis out to the property to look at the cattle. This left Rosa and Clara and Bea with Margaret in the kitchen and the quieter part of the morning to themselves, and it was in this quieter part that Rosa learned something important about where she had landed. Margaret was not a woman who filled silence with sound. She was comfortable in it the way people are comfortable in places they belong to. She moved around the kitchen with the coffee pot and occasionally made a remark about what needed doing for the dinner and occasionally did not remark on anything at all and simply continued. And Rosa found that she was comfortable in the silence too, which surprised her a little because she had not been comfortable in silence for a long time. The months before this one had been full of a particular kind of noise that was not actual sound but was present regardless. The noise of worry and planning, and the constant low-level calculation that a person in a difficult situation runs at all times, the arithmetic of how much is left, and how far it needs to go, and what comes after that. In this kitchen, with Margaret at the counter and Clara at the table drawing something careful and deliberate on the paper she'd been given, and Bea asleep again in the armchair, that arithmetic had gone quiet. Rosa noticed this with the slightly unsettled attention you give to something that is new to you in a good way. She sat with the last of her coffee and let the quiet be quiet, and thought about what it would be like to simply be somewhere, without the constant movement toward the next thing. She had been moving toward the next thing for 8 months. She was good at it, she had discovered. She was a person who could function under sustained pressure without coming apart, who could keep her children fed and safe and appropriately calm in circumstances that were not calm, who could drive through the night and find shelter in the dark, and present herself to strangers in the morning with her name and her history and her intention, without either falling apart or asking for more than she could justify asking for. She was good at all of this, but she was tired. The tiredness was not visible, she thought. She was careful about that. Her children had enough uncertainty without watching their mother show the weight of it. But it was there, and it had been there. And the particular quality of this kitchen on this morning was that it did not require her to manage it. It simply let it be there, and did not make anything of it. Clara looked up from her drawing. She had been working on it with the focused precision she brought to anything she decided to do well, and the result was a careful rendering of the stable as she had seen it that morning, with the horses in their stalls and the lantern on the hook and in the far corner, small and rough but unmistakably present, the shapes of sleeping people. She pushed it across the table to Rosa without saying anything. Rosa looked at it for a long moment. She looked at the tiny shapes in the corner of the drawing, the 4 of them pressed together in Clara's careful pencil lines. She looked at her daughter's face across the table. Clara was watching her with those dark, serious eyes, checking something, the way she always checked her mother when it mattered. "This is good," Rosa said. "It's not finished," Clara said. "Finish it then," Rosa said. Clara pulled it back and went back to work. Rosa looked at Margaret, who had been at the counter during all of this, and who was now looking at the kettle as if deciding whether to put it on again, and whose expression, glimpsed in profile, was something that Rosa filed away to think about later. The expression of a woman who has seen something that pleased her, and has decided not to make a production of being pleased. By mid-morning, Bea had woken from her second nap in the armchair and had been redirected with great efficiency by Margaret toward the business of helping to prepare the Thanksgiving vegetables, which for Bea meant being given a small bowl and a pile of already washed cranberries to sort through, which she did with enormous dedication, occasionally eating one and making a face and then eating another to confirm the sourness. Clara had finished her drawing and started a second one, this time of the kitchen, with Margaret at the counter and Bea at the table, and her mother's hands around a coffee cup and the window, with the morning light coming through it. She drew quickly when she was sure of what she was doing, and slowly when she was thinking through a problem, and the kitchen drawing went quickly, which meant she had seen it already in her mind. Luis came back from the cattle with Dale at 10 o'clock with boots that needed cleaning, and an expression on his face that Rosa had not seen in months. The expression of a boy who has been given information that matters to him, and is still working through the implications. He sat at the kitchen table and accepted the glass of warm milk Margaret put in front of him, and reported everything he had seen and learned in the past hour and a half with the thoroughness of a correspondent filing a complete account. The names of the cattle, the way the feed was distributed, the fact that one of the younger cows had a preference for the left side of the trough that the others had apparently learned to accommodate, the state of the fencing on the east side of the pasture. Dale poured himself a coffee and let Luis talk without interrupting him, which was the right response and which Luis, on some level, appeared to understand was the right response, because he addressed most of his account in Dale's direction rather than Rosa's, which was the direction of reporting back to someone whose opinion of the information mattered. Rosa watched all of this and said nothing. She was learning the specific texture of this place, its rhythms and habits, the way people moved within it. She had always been good at reading places quickly, reading the people in them, and understanding how they fitted together, and what the rules were, the spoken and unspoken ones. What she was reading here was something she had not encountered in exactly this combination before: genuine welcome that did not perform itself, space that did not require her to fill it or explain it. A man and woman who had been doing the same work for 37 years, and had worn the work into them the way water wears stone, smooth and without effort. She thought about what it would mean to be in a place like this, not as a visitor, and not as someone enduring something temporary, as someone who was simply there. She did not let herself think about it too directly yet. It was still only morning. There was a great deal of day to get through, but she thought about it in the background, in the same way she had been thinking about north all those months ago, as a direction, as something that was possibly waiting at the end of a long and uncertain drive. Dale came back inside at 10:15 with Luis right behind him, both of them carrying the cold of the morning on their coats and the easy silence of people who have been working together without needing to talk much. Dale hung his coat on the hook. Luis stood in the middle of the kitchen and announced that the tire was fixed, the van was ready, and that he had held the flashlight the whole time, and that the old tire had a nail in it the size of his thumb. He held up his thumb to demonstrate. "Good work," Rosa said. Luis accepted this with the seriousness it deserved, and went to find his sister. Dale poured a second cup of coffee and sat back down at the table. For a moment he said nothing. He looked at his cup. Then he looked at Rosa in the straightforward way he had, which was not rude but was not careful either. It was simply the way a man looks at something when he is deciding something about it, and does not see a reason to pretend otherwise. "You said you know ranch work," he said. "Yes," Rosa said. "What kind?" She set her cup down. "Feeding and watering stock, cleaning stalls, basic fence maintenance, wire and post, not anything that needs welding, moving cattle with a quad or on foot, either way. First aid for animals, the basic things. Early mornings, late evenings, it doesn't matter." She paused. "My grandfather ran 200 head of cattle in Sonora for 40 years. I worked that land from the time I was 8 until I was 19 and came north." Dale was quiet for a moment, turning his mug slightly on the table, a habit he had without knowing it. "You came north 12 years ago?" he said. 13, she said. "Where did you work?" "Arizona," she said. "First in the citrus groves, then on a horse ranch outside Tucson for 4 years. Then I left the ranch when my children were small because the hours were not compatible." She said this plainly, without apology but also without elaborating. Some things did not need elaboration. Dale looked at her. He was not the kind of man who asked about husbands or asked about money or asked about the reasons a woman with 3 young children was driving alone through Montana on Thanksgiving. Not because he didn't wonder, but because he had been raised to believe that a person's private circumstances were their own until they chose to share them, and that asking before they were ready was a kind of theft. He picked up his coffee mug. He took a sip. He set it back down. "I have a foreman's cottage on the property," he said. "It's been empty 2 years." Rosa looked at him. She said nothing. "My last foreman retired," Dale said. "Man named George Atkins. Been with me 22 years. His wife's health needed him in Billings, so they went." He paused. "I've been managing short-handed since then. My son Greg helps when he can, but he has his own work in town." Rosa was watching him steadily. She had gone very still in the way that people go still when they understand that something important is being said to them, and they are afraid of misunderstanding it. "The cottage has 2 bedrooms, Dale said. Wood stove, kitchen with a working refrigerator. It needs some cleaning. Hasn't been used in a while." He took another sip of coffee. "I could show it to you. After dinner." The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. Margaret, who was at the counter rolling out pastry dough, did not look up. The sound of the rolling pin on the dough continued at exactly the same rhythm it had been maintaining before. "Are you?" Rosa started, and stopped. She started again. Are you saying that you would hire me? I'm saying I could show you the cottage, Dale said. After dinner. You could look at it. Then we could talk about what work needs doing on this property, and whether it matches what you know how to do. He set down his mug. That's what I'm saying. Rosa stared at him. She had a look on her face that Dale had seen before on people who had been managing under hard conditions for a long time. The look of someone who has become so practiced at bracing for disappointment that an offer of something real takes a moment to register as real. I have 3 children, she said. I can see that, Dale said. They would be on the property. The cottage has a yard, Dale said. The school in town is 7 miles. Greg's wife teaches 3rd grade there. Rosa's jaw tightened slightly. Not in anger, in the effort of keeping her expression steady when it did not want to be. Why, she said. The word came out quietly, with a weight behind it. Why would you do this? You don't know me. Dale looked at her for a long moment. He was not, generally, a man who told stories about himself unprompted. But he had asked her a direct question this morning, not in words, but in the action of showing her the cottage would be, and she had a right to understand it. About 32 years ago, he said, before my youngest son was born, we had a fire. The house burned. Not this house. The house we lived in then, on the other side of the county. We lost most of what we had. It was November, middle of the week, and Margaret and I and the 2 older children had nowhere to go. He paused. He turned his coffee mug on the table again, slow and even. A man named Carl Briggs owned the property 2 miles down the road. We had spoken maybe a dozen times in 5 years. He was not a close neighbor. He came out that night and he had a spare bedroom and a pull-out sofa and a wood stove, and he said to come inside. We stayed 3 months. He never asked for anything. Silence. Carl died 8 years ago, Dale said. Lung trouble. I went to his funeral. His wife is in a care home in Missoula now. I send them Christmas cards. He picked up his mug and finished the last of his coffee. A man does what he can while he can do it. That's all. He stood up from the table and went to the stove and poured himself a 3rd cup of coffee. The most coffee Dale Harmon had drunk before noon in many years, Margaret would note privately, though she said nothing about it, and went back to the table and sat down again. Rosa looked at her hands on the table. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I want to be clear about something. All right, Dale said. I am not a person who takes things without working for them, she said. If you show me that cottage, and if we agree on work, I will work. I will work the hours you need and I will do them correctly. I know what early mornings on a ranch feel like. I am not afraid of it, and I will not disappear when the weather is bad. She looked up at him. I want you to understand that before you show me anything. Dale looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once. The same nod he gave when something was settled. I understand it, he said. Margaret was still rolling pastry dough. The rolling pin continued at its steady pace. She was not looking at either of them, and the expression on her face was the particular expression of a woman who is very deliberately not showing what she is feeling, which in this case was something close to deep satisfaction. But she would not have said so because it was still too early, and the day was still unfolding. Outside, they could hear Clara and Luis in the yard. Clara was explaining a game to Luis in the patient, slightly too loud voice that older siblings use when they have explained something twice already and expect it to sink in this time. Luis was apparently arguing about the rules. Their voices came through the window clearly, ordinary and alive, and both Dale and Rosa turned toward the sound briefly without meaning to, the way adults turn toward the sound of children playing outside, pulled by some instinct older than thought. Go sit with them, Rosa said, to no one in particular, and then realized she had said it aloud, and pressed her lips together. They're fine, Margaret said from the counter. Let them run. The morning continued forward. The family that was coming for dinner began to arrive earlier than expected. June Harmon, Dale and Margaret's daughter, was the first, pulling into the gravel drive at 11:15 in a green pickup truck with her husband, a quiet man named Paul who immediately went to find Dale so the 2 of them could talk about fence posts, which was their primary topic of conversation every time they met. June came into the kitchen and stopped when she saw Rosa. She was a woman of about 35, with her father's directness and her mother's warmth, which was a combination Rosa registered immediately. June looked at Rosa, then at the children visible through the kitchen window, then at her mother, and then back at Rosa. Hi, June said. This is Rosa, Margaret said, from the counter. She and her children are joining us for Thanksgiving. June looked at Rosa with the open, uncomplicated curiosity of someone who had grown up in a house where people showed up unexpectedly and were fed, and that was simply how it was. Where are you from? She said, sitting down at the table. Arizona, Rosa said. Most recently. Before that, Sonora. How long have you been driving? June said. Since yesterday afternoon, Rosa said. June looked at her mother. Margaret raised an eyebrow the way that mothers raise eyebrows when they want a child to figure something out without being told. June turned back to Rosa. Well, she said, you picked the right house to land at. My mother makes enough food on Thanksgiving to feed a small town. And my father will not tell you this, but he has been needing someone to help with the ranch since George left. So you may find today useful in more than one way. She said this in one long, easy breath, the way she had been speaking since childhood, direct, warm, slightly ahead of where the conversation was supposed to be. Rosa looked at her. Your father mentioned the cottage, she said carefully. Did he? June leaned back in her chair with the look of someone who had been waiting for this without knowing she was waiting for it. Good. Have you seen it yet? He said after dinner, Rosa said. Right, June said. That's Dad. Everything in order. She leaned forward and helped herself to the last biscuit from the plate on the table. The cottage needs cleaning, just so you know. And the water heater had a problem last winter that Greg was supposed to fix and probably didn't, because Greg does things on a Greg timetable, which is its own thing entirely. She bit into the biscuit. But the bones of it are good. It's a solid little house. Rosa sat with this information. Outside, Luis had found an old basketball near the equipment shed and was attempting to bounce it on the frozen gravel, with limited success. Clara was watching him with the patient skepticism of an older sibling. Greg Harmon arrived at 1:30, as Margaret had predicted, with his wife Karen and their 2 children, a boy of 8 named Sam and a girl of 5 named Lily. Karen taught 3rd grade at the school in town, which Rosa had not known when Margaret mentioned it earlier. Now she looked at this woman, slightly younger than Rosa, with dark curly hair and paint on her left sleeve and a smile that arrived on her face quickly and looked like it meant it, and thought about what Margaret had said, about the school being 7 miles, about Greg's wife teaching there. Karen came into the kitchen and was introduced to Rosa, and she looked at Rosa's children through the window and said, "Oh, they need to meet Lily and Sam. They'll have a blast together," and went back outside before Rosa could respond, returning a moment later with Sam and Lily in tow. The children were immediately pointed toward the yard where Clara and Luis and Bea were, and within 2 minutes there was a complicated multilingual game happening on the frozen gravel that none of the adults could fully follow. Nathan, the oldest Harmon son, arrived from Billings at 2:30. He was quieter than both his siblings, tall like his father, with the careful manner of a man who takes his time forming opinions. He shook Rosa's hand when they were introduced and said it was good to meet her, and Rosa believed him. By 3 o'clock the house was full of noise and warmth and the smell of a Thanksgiving dinner that had been building since early that morning. The table had been extended with a leaf that Dale retrieved from the garage, and chairs had been borrowed from the study and the bedroom, and arranged around it in a way that was slightly haphazard but fit everyone. Rosa had offered to help with the cooking, and Margaret had accepted, which had been the right thing to do. The 2 of them had worked side by side in the kitchen for an hour, and in that time had developed the easy shorthand of people who are comfortable in a kitchen and can share a small space without getting in each other's way. Rosa was someone who cooked by instinct and taste. Margaret was someone who cooked by memory and proportion. Neither of them was wrong. The food that came out of that collaboration was better than it would have been otherwise, and both women knew it, though neither said so. Dinner was served at 4 o'clock. The table was crowded and warm. The food was passed in both directions and the conversation ran over itself, and the children ate with the enthusiastic disorganization of children who have been outside in the cold all afternoon. Bea sat between Rosa and Margaret and ate everything on her plate with a small fork that Margaret had found in the back of a drawer, sized for a child's hand, which she had placed at Bea's setting without comment. When everyone was seated and the food was on the table, Dale looked around the table for a moment. Then he bowed his head and said grace. His voice was low and unhurried, the same voice he used for everything, and the words were simple and meant. He thanked God for the land and the family and the food and the day, and then, at the end, he added something that the rest of the family had not heard him add before. "And we are grateful," he said, "for the people who find their way here, for the ones who come through the door and the ones who come through the stable. May they always find what they need." When he said amen, Rosa looked down at her plate. Her eyes were dry and her expression was steady, but under the table, where no one could see, she had both hands pressed flat against her thighs, holding on to something that had no name. The foreman's cottage smelled like cedar and dry air, and 2 years of no one living in it. Dale unlocked the door with a key from a ring in his coat pocket and pushed it open, and Rosa stepped inside behind him into the late afternoon dim, the last light of the November sun coming through the 2 front windows and falling in pale rectangles on the wooden floor. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the room. It was small, A main room with a wood stove in the corner and 2 windows facing the front of the property, a kitchen along the back wall, basic, functional, a sink and 4 burners and an older refrigerator that hummed when Dale clicked on the power at the breaker box near the door. A short hallway led to 2 bedrooms, each with a single window, a bathroom between them with a clawfoot tub and a shower head that had been added sometime later, mounted over the tub on a curved bar. The floors throughout were solid hardwood, dirty but not damaged. The walls were plaster, off-white, with 1 or 2 small pictures still hanging from when George Atkins had lived there, a framed map of Montana, a photograph of mountains that Rosa could not identify. She walked through the room slowly, the way she walked through any space she was evaluating, not making decisions yet, just gathering information, learning the shape of the thing. Clara was with her, staying 1 step behind, also looking. Luis was outside with Dale's son Greg, who had found a piece of broken farm equipment near the equipment shed that required his urgent inspection. Bea was back at the main house with Margaret, having fallen comprehensively asleep on the living room couch in the way that 4-year-olds fall asleep at the end of a day. Completely, without warning, like a light going out. Clara looked into the smaller of the 2 bedrooms and was quiet for a moment. "This could be mine and Bea's," she said. "We are only looking right now," Rosa said. "I know," Clara said, "but it could be." Rosa stood in the doorway of the bedroom and looked at it. 2 small beds could fit along the walls. There was a closet on the left side with a wooden door that had a small, round ceramic knob. The window faced east, which meant morning light. She could picture it clearly, too clearly, the way you picture things when you want them and are trying not to want them too much because wanting things too much had, in recent experience, created the habit of loss. She went back to the main room. Dale was standing near the wood stove, examining the flue lever with the careful attention he gave to mechanical things. "Is there a problem with it?" Rosa asked. "No," he said. "It's in good shape." George kept his stoves clean. He closed the flue and opened it again, testing the movement. "I'll bring wood over tomorrow. There's 2 cords stacked by the main barn." Rosa stood in the middle of the main room with her arms crossed, not from coldness, though it was cold in the cottage, the chill of a space that had not had heat in it for a while, but in the way she crossed her arms when she was thinking carefully about something. "What would the work be?" she said. Dale let the flue lever rest in the open position and turned toward her. "Morning feeding. Every day. I have 14 head of cattle, and the 2 horses, and a pen of hogs, that Greg started last spring and lost interest in. Stall cleaning, 3 times a week at minimum. I have a stretch of fencing along the south pasture that needs attention before the hard winter sets in. About 400 feet of wire that's sagging in places, some posts that need resetting. In spring they'll be calving, which means night checks when the time comes." He paused. "In exchange, the cottage is yours. No rent. I'll pay a working wage for the hours. Same rate I paid George." Rosa looked at him. "What rate did you pay George?" Dale told her. Rosa was quiet for a moment, doing the arithmetic. It was not a large wage by any measure, but combined with no housing cost it was more than she had been working with for months, more than she had thought to ask for. "There's one more thing," Dale said. Rosa waited. "The water heater," Dale said. "Greg was supposed to look at it in January. He did not. He said this without particular blame. It was simply information. It needs a new element. I'll have it fixed before you move in." Clara, who had been in the doorway of the bedroom this whole time, listening with the attentiveness she brought to things that mattered, looked at her mother. She did not say anything. She simply looked. Rosa looked at Dale. "When do you need an answer?" she said. "No rush," Dale said. "You can think about it." "I don't need to think about it," Rosa said. Then she stopped herself. Because that was not entirely true, and she was not a person who said things that were not true. "I mean, I don't need long," she said. "I would like to sleep on it, one night." Dale nodded. "One night," he said, as if this were a perfectly reasonable business negotiation, which in his mind it was. "You'll stay in the main house tonight. Margaret's already made up the guest room." Rosa started to say something about not wanting to impose further, and Dale looked at her with the patient, slightly resigned expression of a man who has heard this particular objection several times that day and has developed an efficient response to it. "It's one night," he said. "The children can't sleep in a cold cottage. There's no wood in the stove yet." Rosa closed her mouth. She looked around the cottage one more time. She looked at the windows and the wooden floor, and the kitchen along the back wall, and the 2 bedrooms down the short hallway. She looked at the map of Montana on the wall, which showed every county and every river and every town, including the small black dot for the town 7 miles away, where there was a school, and Greg's wife Karen taught 3rd grade. "All right," she said. "One night." They walked back to the main house through the early dark. Dale slightly ahead, Clara holding Rosa's hand, the frozen ground crunching under their feet. The main house glowed from its windows, the warmth and light of it visible from across the drive. The sounds of the remaining family members inside muffled but present. Greg and Nathan talking about something in the kitchen, June's voice rising over them briefly, a child laughing somewhere in the house. Rosa stopped for a moment outside the kitchen door and looked back at the cottage across the dark drive. She could barely see it in the dark, just the outline of its roof against the slightly lighter sky. Clara looked up at her. "Mama," she said. "Yes," Rosa said, not looking down yet. "Luis already picked his room," Clara said. Rosa looked down at her then. Clara's expression was perfectly serious. "He picked the wrong one," Rosa said. "I told him," Clara said. Rosa pushed the kitchen door open and they went inside. The night passed in the particular comfort of a house that has had many people in it all day and is now settling. The dishes were done. The table was cleared. Greg and his family had gone home to town. Nathan had started the long drive back to Billings. June and Paul were in the living room talking quietly with Dale and Margaret. The children, all of them, the Harmon grandchildren included before they left, and Clara and Luis and Bay who remained, had eaten the second round of pie that Margaret produced at 8 o'clock, with the calm certainty of a woman who knew exactly when pie was required. Now it was late and quiet. Luis had fallen asleep in front of the television in the study, midway through a nature program about wolves that he had been watching with enormous interest. Dale had carried him to the guest room without waking him, which was the second time that day he had carried a sleeping child somewhere, and he did it with the same unhurried ease as before. And Rosa noticed this the same way she had noticed it before, quietly, filing it away in the part of her mind where she kept the things that were important. Clara was asleep in the narrow bed beside Bea, her arm over her sister in the same protective position she had held in the stable the night before, except that now she was warm, and the bed had clean sheets, and there was a lamp on the bedside table turned low. Rosa sat on the edge of the pull-out bed in the study after Luis was settled, and she looked at her son's sleeping face. He looked peaceful. He had not looked peaceful in his sleep for a long time. Children carry the tension of their circumstances into their sleep the same way adults do, and for months Luis had slept with a tightness around his brow that she had noticed and could not fix, and had hated herself a little for not being able to fix. Tonight it was gone. He looked like what he was, a 6-year-old boy who had spent the day fixing a tire and playing in a yard and eating pie, and who was now deeply and completely asleep. She reached out and brushed his hair back from his forehead with the tips of her fingers, so gently that she did not wake him. Then she got up and went to the kitchen, because she had known even before she left the guest room that she was not going to sleep yet. Margaret was there. This did not entirely surprise Rosa. There was something about Margaret Harmon that suggested she knew, on a level that did not require explanation, when someone needed a kitchen at midnight. She was sitting at the table with a cup of something that was probably not coffee at this hour, and she looked up when Rosa came in without any particular surprise, and pulled out the chair across from her with one foot. Rosa sat down. Margaret reached up and took a second mug from the hook and poured something from a small pot on the stove. Chamomile. Rosa could smell it, and set it in front of her. "Can't sleep?" Margaret said. "I keep thinking," Rosa said. "About the cottage?" "About everything," Rosa said. She wrapped her hands around the mug. The chamomile was warm, and smelled like the end of something, like the last hour of a long day. "About whether this is real." "It's real," Margaret said. "I know that," Rosa said. "In my head I know it. But there's another part of me that has been careful for so long, that it doesn't quite believe things when they're good." She looked at her mug. "I am not saying your husband is not trustworthy. I believe he is. I believe you both are. I am saying the problem is with me, with what I have gotten used to." Margaret looked at her across the table. In the quiet kitchen with the low light and the late hour, her face was easy and patient. "How long have you been carrying everything by yourself?" she said. Rosa was quiet for a moment. "About 8 months," she said. "Properly alone, I mean. Before that it was complicated." "What happened 8 months ago?" Rosa looked at her. She had not told anyone the full truth of it yet. The version she had given Dale at breakfast was the version she gave everyone. The accident, the bills, the job. It was all true. It was just not all of it. "My husband is in prison," she said. The words sat in the kitchen between them, flat and heavy. Rosa did not look away from Margaret's face when she said it. She had learned that looking away was worse, that it invited people to fill the silence with whatever they imagined, and what people imagined was usually worse than the truth. Margaret's expression did not change. There was no flinch, no quick reset of features into a careful neutral. the expression that people perform when they are trying not to show what they actually feel. She simply listened. "He made a bad decision," Rosa said. "During the worst time we had, when there was no money and the children needed things and he was terrified and not thinking well, it was one decision, and he would take it back, if he could, and he cannot." She paused. "He is a good man who did a wrong thing. I know people say that, and sometimes it is not true. In his case it is." She looked down at her mug. "I did not tell your husband this morning because I did not know how to say it, and because I was not sure it mattered yet. Now I think it matters." "Why does it matter?" Margaret said. "Because if I come here," Rosa said, "if I bring my children here and we build something here, then eventually there will be the question of Eduardo, of when he comes out, of whether he comes here." She looked up. "I won't pretend that isn't coming. I won't start something in this place and then surprise you with it later. That's not how I operate." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Outside the kitchen window, the Montana night was absolutely dark and absolutely still. The land lay under its thin snow in silence. "How long does he have?" Margaret said. 7 months, Rosa said, "if the early release is approved." Margaret nodded slowly. Then she picked up her mug and took a small sip and set it back down and said, "Tell Dale in the morning. He deserves to know, and he will want to know before you move in." "Do you think it will change his answer?" Rosa said. Margaret thought about this genuinely, which Rosa appreciated. She did not offer an instant reassurance. She actually thought about it. "No," she said finally. "It won't change his answer, but it will mean something to him that you told him. Dale trusts people who tell him the true thing, even when the true thing is hard." She paused. "Especially when it's hard." Rosa sat with this for a while. The house was very quiet around them. Somewhere, a wind had come up outside, and it moved across the roof with a low sound that was not quite a whistle, more like breath. "He reminds me of my grandfather," Rosa said quietly. "Not in his face or his size, in how he moves. Careful and sure. Like he knows exactly how much weight he can carry, and has never tried to carry more or less." Margaret smiled at that. The real smile, not the polite one. "That's him," she said. 39 years, and I have never been able to improve on that description." Rosa looked out the dark window. Then she looked at her mug. Then she looked at Margaret. "I'm going to say yes," she said. "I know," Margaret said. "I'm going to say yes in the morning, when the children are awake, so they're part of it, so they know from the beginning." "That's the right way to do it," Margaret said. Rosa nodded. She finished her chamomile. She set the mug in the sink. She said goodnight to Margaret and walked back down the hallway to the study and lay down on the pull-out bed next to Luis and closed her eyes. The wind moved across the roof. The house held its warmth around her. Somewhere in the room, she could hear Luis breathing in the deep, easy rhythm of a sleeping child, and the sound of it was, in its small and ordinary way, the most beautiful thing she had heard in months. Rosa told Dale at breakfast the next morning, with the children present the way she had said she would. She had made up her mind the night before about how to do it, and the morning arrived with the same pale, cold light as the day before, and she sat down at the kitchen table across from Dale and Margaret and said what she needed to say. She told him about Eduardo. She said it the same way she had said it to Margaret the night before, clearly, without asking for anything except to be heard. She told him the shape of it, the decision Eduardo had made when they were at their lowest point, the consequence of it, the 7 months remaining, the possibility of early release. She told it in 2 minutes without looking away from Dale's face. Dale listened with his hands around his coffee mug and his eyes on her. He did not move, and he did not speak, and his expression did not change in any way that Rosa could read. When she finished, he looked at his coffee mug. He turned it on the table once, the slow, habitual movement she had already come to recognize as thinking. Luis was eating cereal beside her. He did not look up. Clara was watching her father's face with the same attention she had been watching adults' faces for months. Bia was in Margaret's lap, occupied with a piece of toast. "How long ago did it happen?" Dale said. 8 months ago, Rosa said. "Just under." "And the children know he's there?" Dale said. "They know their father is away," Rosa said. "Clara knows more than the younger two. She is 9. She paused. "I have not hidden it from her. I just haven't put all of it into words she didn't need yet." Dale nodded. He looked at the table for another moment. Then he looked up at Rosa. "Does it change the work?" he said. Rosa blinked. "What do you mean?" "Does what you've told me change your ability to do the work here?" he said. "No," she said. "Then it doesn't change my answer," he said. He picked up his coffee and took a sip. "When he comes out, when that time comes, we'll talk about it then. But that's 7 months from now, and there's fence down on my south pasture right now, and 14 head of cattle that need feeding this morning." He stood up. He took his coat from the hook. He looked at Luis. "You want to come see the cattle?" he said. Luis looked up from his cereal with the full bright alertness of a boy who had been waiting to be asked something like this since the previous morning. "Yes," he said. "Finish your cereal first," Dale said. He went outside. Luis ate his cereal in the fastest focused silence Rosa had ever observed in her son. Clara looked at Rosa. "Did we decide?" Clara said. "We decided," Rosa said. Clara nodded once, the way she had seen her mother nod. Once, decisively, the matter settled. "I'm going to need shelves," Clara said. "Good morning to you too," Rosa said. Clara smiled, the real smile, not the careful one. It appeared on her face quickly and changed it completely, and Rosa felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came from looking at her daughter's real smile, the one that had been absent for too long and had only just started coming back. They moved into the cottage 4 days later. Dale and Greg brought wood over the morning before and stacked it beside the front door. Karen came from town with a bag of cleaning supplies, and she and Rosa scrubbed the cottage from top to bottom in a morning, which was how Rosa and Karen became friends. Not through conversation exactly, though there was conversation, but through the shared labor of cleaning a space that needed cleaning, which creates a specific kind of easy understanding between people that other activities do not. Greg fixed the water heater element on the second day. He arrived mid-morning with tools and parts and a loose cheerfulness that was entirely unlike his father and yet somehow connected to him, and he worked on the heater in the bathroom for an hour while Rosa arranged the kitchen, and when he was done he came and stood in the kitchen doorway with his hands in his pockets and said, "All good in there," and Rosa thanked him and he nodded and said, "No problem," and then stood there for another few seconds looking around the kitchen as if checking to see that everything was in order, which it was, because Rosa had been arranging it with the focused efficiency she brought to practical tasks. "My dad doesn't say much," Greg said, after a moment. "I noticed," Rosa said. "He likes you," Greg said. "For him, that means he showed you the cottage." "I figured that," Rosa said. Greg nodded, satisfied. "Karen says you're good people," he said. "Karen is kind," Rosa said. "She's also right," Greg said. "She's usually right." He picked up his tools from the floor. "Anything else breaks, call me first. Nathan's an hour away, and Dad will try to fix things himself. And sometimes that goes fine, and sometimes it goes less fine." He said this with the fond resignation of a youngest child who has been watching his father approach mechanical problems with perhaps too much confidence for 37 years. Rosa smiled. "I'll call you," she said. Greg left. Rosa went back to the kitchen. Through the window she could see Clara and Bea in the small yard behind the cottage, Clara drawing something in the dirt with a stick while Bea watched and made occasional suggestions that Clara was very diplomatically not following. Luis was out with Dale, as he had been every morning since the day after Thanksgiving. He had attached himself to Dale's daily ranch routine with the single-minded purposefulness of a child who has decided that a person is worth learning from, and Dale, to Rosa's quiet astonishment, had simply accommodated this without complaint and without making a production of it, going about his morning work with Luis 2 steps behind him, answering questions when they were asked, and leaving spaces of silence that Luis, to his credit, was learning to respect. This was, Rosa thought, one of the most remarkable things she had seen in a long time. A man teaching a child simply by letting the child be present. No announcement of the lesson, no framing, just the work, and the presence, and the slow accumulation of things learned by watching and doing. The first full week on the ranch was physical in a way Rosa had not experienced in years. She rose before 6 every morning in the cold dark of the cottage, and dressed quickly, and went across the frost-covered ground to the stable and began the feeding. Dale had shown her the routine on the first morning. Cattle first, then horses, then the hog pen that was Greg's lingering project. The amounts, the times, the particular way Copper needed to be approached from the front because she had a blind spot on her left that spooked her. The way Abe, the old gray gelding, liked his hay placed at the far right of his stall and would stand in the corner looking aggrieved if you put it anywhere else. Dale showed her these things once. Only once. He had the rancher's instinct for knowing the difference between someone who needed to be shown twice and someone who did not, and Rosa did not. She absorbed information about animals quickly, from the habit of years, and Dale recognized this on the first morning and thereafter simply came out after she had finished to check, not because he did not trust her but because he was that kind of man, the kind who checks the work regardless of who did it, including his own. The fencing along the south pasture was the bigger project. 400 feet of sagging wire over hard ground was serious work in any season, but in November, With the ground half frozen and the temperature dropping every afternoon below what Rosa would have considered reasonable working conditions, it was demanding in a particular way. Dale worked beside her on the fence. He did not offer to have her do other things while he handled the heavy posts. He simply handed her the right tool at the right moment and worked in parallel, and they went through it section by section over 5 days, resetting posts and retentioning wire and checking staples. And by the end of the 5th day, the south pasture fence was as solid as it had been 10 years before. "Good work," Dale said, on that last afternoon, looking at the finished stretch. "Thank you," Rosa said. They walked back to the barn in the early dark without speaking, and the silence was comfortable, which was its own form of acceptance. At night, Rosa made dinner for her children in the cottage kitchen. She cooked simply and well, the way she had learned from her grandmother, rice and beans and whatever else was available, made into something worth eating by attention and patience. She had found that the local grocery in town, 7 miles down the road, was small but adequate, and that Karen had stopped by with a bag of things on the 2nd day, with the casual offering of a woman who knows a new household needs basics and doesn't need to make a ceremony of providing them. Karen had also, on that second visit, mentioned the school. "Clara should come Monday," she said, standing in the cottage doorway. "I can drive her if Rosa needs a way in." This was how she said it, not offering to take Clara, but offering to take Rosa too, keeping Rosa's independence intact in the offer. Rosa had taken them both to school on Monday, in the repaired van. Clara had walked in without looking back. Luis had cried briefly at the door of his classroom, the contained, dignified kind of crying that 6-year-olds do when they are trying very hard not to. And then he had gone in, and by the time Rosa came to collect him at 3 o'clock he had made a friend whose name was Owen, and who had, Luis reported at dinner, a dog that could open doors with its paw, which was the most important thing that had happened that day. Bea was too young for school yet. She spent the mornings with Rosa and the cattle and the horses, wrapped in the small down jacket that was the warmest thing she owned, watching the animals with an absorption that bordered on scientific. She had discovered that Copper would let her feed grass through the fence bars if she held it very flat on her palm, and she had been conducting this experiment every morning with quiet dedication. Life on the ranch developed its own rhythm. It was not comfortable exactly. The work was hard, and the mornings were cold, and there were still evenings when Rosa sat at the kitchen table after the children were in bed and looked at the wall and felt the weight of everything that was still uncertain. But it was a rhythm, and rhythm was something she had not had in a long time, and she had forgotten, in the months of dislocation, how much a person needs it, not ease. Just rhythm. A next thing to do that makes sense after the last thing. On the Friday of the 2nd week, Margaret came to the cottage door in the early evening with a covered dish. "Lamb stew," she said. She had made too much. She handed Rosa the dish and was turning to go when Rosa asked if she wanted to come in. Margaret came in. She sat at the kitchen table and Rosa poured tea and the children came in from the back room where they had been doing homework. Clara with her careful, precise handwriting, and Luis with his pencil gripped too tight, and sat with them, and the 4 of them ate stew at the small cottage table while Margaret drank her tea. Bea, who had been watching Margaret from across the table for the better part of 10 minutes, finally said, "Do you have any more biscuits?" "Bea," Rosa said. "It's a fair question," Margaret said. She reached into the deep pocket of her coat and produced, with perfect calm, a small cloth bag that contained 2 biscuits wrapped in wax paper. She set it on the table in front of Bea. Bea looked at the bag, looked at Margaret. Then she climbed out of her chair, went around the table, and put her arms around Margaret's waist, and pressed her face against her coat. Margaret's hands, which had been resting on the table, moved. She placed one hand on Bea's back, gently, the practiced ease of a grandmother. She looked at Rosa over the top of Bea's head. Rosa looked back at her. For a moment neither of them said anything. Then Margaret reached into the bag with her free hand and gave one of the biscuits to Bea, and the evening continued. The school in town had a Christmas concert in the 2nd week of December, the kind of event that small-town schools have been having for as long as there have been small towns in winters. Children in varying degrees of formal dress standing on a risers arrangement that tilts slightly to the left and singing songs that they have been practicing since October, with the mixed results of a group that contains some children who are genuinely musical and some who are enthusiastically approximate. Karen told Rosa about it on a Tuesday, and Karen's son Sam told Luis about it at school the same day, and Luis came home and reported it as a matter of significant importance. Clara, who had already been informed by her teacher Helen Briggs and had been privately looking forward to it since the announcement, received Luis's news with the diplomatic patience of someone who was aware that Luis thought he was delivering new information. Rosa borrowed a dress from Karen for herself. Clara had one good dress that she had brought from Arizona and had been saving without saying what she was saving it for. Louise required a dress shirt, and Karen's husband Greg produced one from his closet that fit Louise approximately, and which Louise wore with an air of great dignity. Bea wore her best outfit, which was a red corduroy dress that had been a size too large when a family friend in Arizona gave it to her 6 months earlier, and which now fit perfectly, which Rosa considered one of the smaller but more satisfying pieces of evidence that things were generally moving in the right direction. They arrived at the school gymnasium at 6:30. Karen had saved seats, which was both kind and practical because the gymnasium was filling quickly with the particular density of a community event in a small town where everyone knows everyone, and there are no strangers except the ones who have recently become not strangers, which was the category Rosa and her children now occupied. People nodded at Rosa. Helen Briggs came over before the concert started and said hello and told Rosa that Clara had a good ear and had been given a small solo part, which was information Rosa had not had and which she absorbed with the external calm of a woman who was not going to show a stranger's gymnasium how proud she was until she had a moment alone to do it properly. Dale and Margaret came to the concert. This also had not been announced in advance. They simply appeared, Dale with his coat still on and Margaret in the good sweater she wore to things that mattered, and they sat 2 rows behind Rosa and the children, and when Clara stepped forward for her 8-bar solo and sang it clearly and precisely with her eyes fixed on a point somewhere above the audience, in the way that nervous singers fix their eyes, Rosa heard a small sound from behind her that she recognized as Margaret breathing differently. After the concert, in the gymnasium lobby where people stood with paper cups of cider and the noise was considerable, Dale found Louise near the refreshment table and said, without preamble, that he had been good company on the morning cattle run. This was, Rosa understood by now, a high-order compliment delivered in its smallest possible package, and Louise understood it too, because his expression went immediately to the particular bright focus it wore when something genuinely mattered to him. "Can I come again?" Louise said. "Tomorrow morning," Dale said. 5:45. Louise looked at Rosa. Rosa looked at Dale. "That is very early," she said. "Cattle don't wait," Dale said. 5:45, Louise told Rosa, as if she had not heard. She had heard. She drove home in the dark with the children quiet in the back of the van, Bea already asleep in her coat, Clara holding her program from the concert folded in her lap, and she thought about what it meant to be known, not in the large sense, in the small specific sense of a community that came to a gymnasium on a cold night in December, and stayed until the cider ran out, and nodded at you in the lobby, because you were the woman from the Harmon property now. You were known. You had a location in the world that was identifiable, and that you were connected to. She had not had that in a long time. She had not realized until she had it again how much it weighed, its absence. The weeks between the concert and Christmas were busy in the physical way that December is always busy on a working ranch. Extra preparations for the cold, the equipment checks and the insulation of certain pipes and the stocking of feed against the possibility of being unable to move vehicles in deep snow. Rosa had learned these things in her first weeks, and the repetition now, 3 weeks in, made them comfortable. She knew the sequence, she knew the timings. She knew that Copper needed the heavier blanket when the temperature dropped below a certain threshold, and that Abe would stand at the back of his stall and refuse to come forward if the wind was loud, and that the surest way to get Abe to move was not to coax him, but to simply stand in front of him and wait, because Abe was a horse that responded to patience, and did not respond at all to urgency. She thought sometimes that Abe was a good teacher. She thought about this during the long mornings, alone in the cold stable before anyone else was up, the horses breathing and the hay rustling, and the particular quality of silence that a stable has before dawn, the quality of something that is fully alive but not yet in motion. She thought about patience as a practice rather than a quality, something you did rather than something you were, and she thought about how she had learned to practice it in the months before this one, in ways she had not chosen and would not have chosen, and how the learning had been real even though the lesson had been hard. Louise was at the stable at 5:45 the morning after the concert, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. He became, without any formal declaration, a permanent part of the morning routine, arriving at the stable in the dark, with his coat buttoned and his boots on correctly, which had not always been the case in the early weeks. Dale showed him things each morning with the patience he brought to everything, and Louise absorbed them with the same patience in return, which was, Rosa suspected, part of what made them work well together, a similar quality of attention directed at the same things. Clara had started a new reading project, a series of books about natural history that Helen Briggs had recommended after the bird migration report. And she came home from the library each week with one or two more, and worked through them at the kitchen table after school, with the systematic pleasure of someone who has found a category of knowledge that opens outward in all directions the more you go into it. She had begun, quietly, to accumulate observations from her reading that she wanted to verify against the actual landscape around her, and she had started asking Dale questions at dinner, when the Harmons came for their twice-weekly meals together, questions about soil and weather patterns and what grew where on the property and why, and Dale answered these questions with a precision and depth that Rosa had not fully expected, because she had known that Dale knew his land, but had not realized how much he knew about why it was the way it was, the geography and the ecology and the history of it, going back further than his own tenure. Clara and Dale had developed, without anyone planning it, a quiet working relationship around these questions. She brought the books, he brought the land. They compared what one said with what the other contained. Rosa watched this from wherever she happened to be in the room, and thought about the things you did not expect to grow out of a cold morning in a stable. Christmas itself was warm inside, which is the best you can say about Montana Decembers, and is, in its way, exactly enough. December arrived with a genuine cold that made the cold before it seem like practice. The temperature dropped steadily through the first week of the month and did not come back up, settling into the kind of persistent deep freeze that the old-timers in the county could identify by the way it made the air feel. The ground froze solid. The stock tank had to be broken each morning before the cattle could drink. Rosa did this with the long-handled iron bar that Dale kept hanging just inside the stable door, and that George Atkins had apparently named the Persuader, because that label, in faded marker, was still visible near the top of the handle. Rosa found this amusing. She did not say so to Dale, but she called it by its name in her own head, every cold morning, when she swung it down and heard the ice crack. She was good at the work. She had known she would be, because she had done it before, and the body remembers physical labor the way it remembers nothing else, not through thought but through motion, the muscles finding old patterns, the hands knowing what to do before the mind has finished forming the instruction. But knowing she was good at it and experiencing it again were two different things, and the experience carried a particular satisfaction that she had not felt in years. To be competent at something necessary. To finish a morning's work and know that it was done correctly, and that the animals were fed and the fences held and the stalls were clean. These were simple things, but they were real things, and they belonged entirely to her own effort. Dale noticed. He said nothing about it directly, that was not his way, but he began leaving her to the morning routine without checking, which for him was a form of high praise. And he started including her in conversations about the ranch that were not strictly about her assigned work, the question of whether to expand the herd in spring, the state of the north pasture, the equipment that was aging and would need replacing. He talked about these things the way he talked about everything, briefly and directly, sitting at the stable workbench over coffee in the early morning while the horses ate and the cold pressed against the walls. Rosa listened and occasionally offered an observation, and Dale considered those observations with the same weight he would have given them from anyone else. This was what it felt like to be taken seriously, Rosa thought, not to be complimented or thanked or acknowledged in the performing way that some people treated women who did physical work, with the slight extra emphasis that turned genuine recognition into something closer to surprise, just to be spoken to as someone whose opinion on the north pasture had reasonable value. Clara was settling. This was the clearest and most constant source of quiet joy in Rosa's days, watching her oldest daughter relax into this new place, slowly, the way a person who has been holding their shoulders very high for a long time eventually, gradually, lets them down. The school in town was small enough that Clara did not disappear into it. Her teacher, a woman in her 50s named Helen Briggs, had identified Clara as precise and capable within the first week, and had given her work that matched her, which was all Clara needed. Clara did not need attention. She needed challenge. Helen Briggs understood this. Clara came home from school talking about history and fractions and the migratory patterns of birds, and the talking was itself the sign that she felt safe. Clara had not talked much about school in Arizona that last year. Luis had settled differently, not into the school, which he found adequate but not particularly compelling, but into the ranch. He had become Dale's shadow in a way that Rosa sometimes started to worry about, then stopped worrying about, because she could see that Dale was neither annoyed by it nor artificially encouraging it. He was simply present, and Luis was drawn to presence of that particular quality the way plants are drawn to consistent light. By December, Luis could name every animal on the property and identify their individual habits and preferences. He could explain accurately how to retension barbed wire. He had learned to read the cattle's behavior in a way that surprised Dale, catching early signs of stress or illness in an animal before Dale himself had noticed. once pointing out that one of the cows was standing apart from the others in a way that turned out to be the beginning of a respiratory infection that they caught early and treated without serious consequence. "He's got the eye," Dale said to Rosa one morning, coming in for coffee after Luis had gone off to school. "What does that mean?" Rosa said. "Some people can read animals," Dale said. "You either have it or you don't. It's not something you learn, it's something you discover in yourself." He poured his coffee. "He has it." Rosa thought about this for a while. She thought about Luis at home in Sonora, and about her grandfather, who had that same quality. The way animals moved differently around him, calmer and more deliberate, as if they could sense the particular quality of his attention. She had always thought it was specific to her grandfather, one of his private gifts. Watching it appear in Luis felt like finding something she had assumed was lost. The harder evenings were also present. Rosa did not pretend otherwise to herself. There were nights when the children were in bed, and the cottage was quiet, and the cold settled around the walls, and she sat with things she could not put down. Eduardo occupied those evenings most reliably, not with anger. She had processed most of the anger in the first months, alone in the apartment before the apartment became too expensive. What remained was more complicated, a kind of grief for something that was not dead but was not present. A love that had nowhere to go for 7 months, reduced to the occasional letter, to the mental notes she kept of things she would tell him when she could, to the feeling of explaining him to her children in terms that were true, but were also partial, because the full truth still had edges that were sharp. She had written to him 3 times since arriving at the ranch, careful letters that described the cottage and the work, and the children's adjustment and the horses and Dale and Margaret, without making any of it sound like a life that didn't include him. Because she did not believe she was building something that didn't include him. She believed she was building a foundation, and foundations needed to exist before you could build the rest on top. Whether he would be part of the rest of it, that was the question she held in those quiet evenings without yet having an answer. One night in the second week of December, she was sitting on the cottage porch in a coat and boots, which was objectively unreasonable at 11 at night in Montana in December, but she needed the air and the dark and to be outside walls for a few minutes without anyone needing her. The stars over the Montana hills were extraordinary, more than she had ever seen in Arizona, the kind of display that people in cities can go an entire lifetime without knowing exists. She sat with her back against the porch wall and her knees pulled up and looked at the sky. She heard the main house door open, then footsteps on gravel. Then Margaret appeared at the edge of the porch, wearing her coat over her robe and boots she had not laced up, carrying 2 mugs. Rosa looked at her. "Do you have a system?" she said. "For knowing when someone is on the porch at midnight?" "I saw the light from the bedroom window," Margaret said. She came up the steps and sat in the wooden chair and held out one of the mugs. "Chamomile again. Are you all right?" "I'm thinking," Rosa said, "about Eduardo." Margaret sat with her. She did not try to solve it or reframe it or offer a perspective. She simply sat in the cold with her unlaced boots and her chamomile, and was present. A long time passed. "What was he like?" Margaret said finally. "Before?" Rosa thought about it. She looked at the stars. "Funny," she said. "He was very funny, in a quiet way. He would say something that was exactly the right observation, at exactly the right moment, and it would land without any announcement of itself, and then he would look at you sideways to see if you caught it." She paused. "He was afraid of chickens, fully grown man, raised on a farm in Sonora, and chickens made him very uncomfortable. We had 4 chickens the first 2 years we were married, and he was never quite at ease with any of them." Margaret laughed, a genuine one, surprised out of her. Rosa smiled at the dark. "He is a good father," Rosa said, the smile fading into something quieter. "He loves those children in a way you can see, not a performing kind of love, the kind that is in how he talks to them, in what he notices about them." She looked down at her mug. "Luis has a memory. Things Eduardo said to him when he was 4. He brings them out sometimes when it is relevant, the way you bring out something valuable from a drawer. He doesn't always know he is doing it. He is very like you," Margaret said. "He is very like his father," Rosa said. "He is both," Margaret said. "The observing, that is you. The way he charges at things he has decided to care about, that is someone else." Rosa turned this over. She thought it might be accurate. She finished her chamomile. The cold had settled deeper, and she could see their breath in the still air, 2 small clouds rising and dispersing into the dark. "I do not know what to hope for," Rosa said. "That is the truest thing I can say right now. I know what I want. I am less certain what is good." "Those are often different things," Margaret said. "Yes," Rosa said. They sat for another few minutes. An owl called from somewhere in the dark tree line, once, the sound cutting clean through the cold air. Then silence. "Come inside," Margaret said. "You will freeze out here." Rosa stood. She looked at the stars one more time, the sweep of them across the dark. So many that they gave the sky depth and weight, rather than just distance. She had looked at the sky differently every morning since arriving at the ranch. Less like a ceiling, more like a field she was standing under. She went inside. Margaret went back across the gravel to the main house. Rosa checked on the children, all three breathing, all three deeply asleep. Bea with one arm thrown up over her head in the reckless comfort of very small children. Rosa stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she went to bed. She slept better that night than she had in weeks. She did not know entirely why, only that something about sitting in the cold under those stars and saying the truest thing aloud had taken some pressure off a place inside her that had been holding it for a long time. Not a resolution, just a release. There was a difference between those two things, and the difference mattered. In the morning she got up before 6 and dressed in the dark and went out to feed the cattle. The ground was white with new frost. Copper was awake and looking over her stall door with the alert, hopeful expression she wore every morning at feeding time. Abe was standing in his corner, aggrieved about nothing in particular. Rosa picked up the iron bar and went to break the ice on the stock tank. The iron met the ice cracked, the morning began. January came in hard. The first week brought snow that settled 3 feet deep across the pastures and required the snowblower on the tractor to keep the path between the cottage and the stable clear enough to walk. Dale showed Rosa how to operate the tractor on the second morning after the snow, standing beside it with his coat collar up and speaking clearly over the engine noise about the throttle and the blade angle. And Rosa operated it the same afternoon while he watched from the stable door with his coffee. She had driven larger equipment on her grandfather's farm, and it took her perhaps 20 minutes to feel fully comfortable with this particular machine. And after that, she used it every morning that required it. The children adapted to the snow with the pure enthusiasm of people encountering large amounts of it for the first time. Bea had never seen real snow before. She stood in the yard on the first morning and turned slowly in a circle with her arms out and her face up, snowflakes landing on her nose and her open eyes, and her expression was one of those expressions that adults try and fail to replicate. The complete unguarded wonder of someone experiencing something beautiful for the first time, with nothing in the way of it. Luis built a snow structure of indeterminate purpose on the south side of the cottage. Clara helped for a while and then stopped helping when she and Luis disagreed about the structural design and she went inside to read, which was what Clara did when she had exhausted her diplomatic options. Bea stayed with Luis and contributed snowballs placed at random along the structure, which Luis incorporated without complaint. Dale watched all of this from the equipment shed one afternoon without appearing to watch it, in the way that people who are not accustomed to having children around begin, almost without realizing, to arrange their work so they can see the yard. Margaret brought hot chocolate over on the afternoon of the first big snow. She appeared at the cottage door at 3 o'clock with a thermos and 4 mugs on a tray, and everyone stood on the cottage porch in their coats and boots and drank it, including Dale, who had materialized from somewhere on the property, and who accepted a mug with the mild, slightly surprised expression of a man who had not expected to be offered hot chocolate, and found, on reflection, that he did not object to it. It was, Rosa thought, watching her children and these 2 old ranchers on the small cottage porch in the snow, an entirely normal scene. That was the remarkable thing. It felt ordinary. It had begun to feel, in small and accumulating ways, like something that had always been, and the part of her that had spent months bracing for the next hard thing was beginning, very slowly and not without resistance, to believe that this was actually real. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in February. Rosa knew it before she opened it. The way you know certain things before they happen, not from any rational prediction, but from a quality of stillness that surrounds the moment. She had picked up the mail at the box at the end of the drive that morning after dropping the children at school, and the envelope was third in the small stack, standard white, with the return address that she recognized immediately, and that made her stop walking on the gravel drive with the cold air around her, and hold the stack of mail without moving for a moment before she went inside. She put the other mail on the kitchen table. She sat down. She set the envelope in front of her and looked at it. Eduardo's handwriting was on the front. She had not seen his handwriting in several weeks, because the last letter she had received from him had been in January, and it had been shorter than the ones before it, 3 pages instead of 6, and written in the careful way he wrote when he was choosing every word rather than simply writing, which meant he had been working out something complicated, and had not finished working it out yet. This letter was thick. She could tell from the weight of it, the slight stiffness of multiple folded pages inside. She made herself a cup of coffee first. This was not procrastination, or not only procrastination. It was the instinct of someone who has learned that certain things are better read with both hands warm and something solid in front of you. She read it at the kitchen table with the morning light coming through the window and the coffee steaming beside her. It was 8 pages. Eduardo had not written 8 pages since the first letter, the one that had arrived 3 months after he had gone in, the one she had read 4 times in 2 days and then put in the box on the high shelf in the bedroom closet and not taken down again for a month because it had too much in it to look at all at once. This letter was different from that one. The first one had been full of apology, which she had needed at the time, and had also found difficult, because the apology was real and she had believed it, and it had made her angry and sad at the same time, in a way that was hard to process. This one was not about apology. This one was about what was coming next. He wrote about the program he had completed. He was specific and detailed about it in a way that was not boastful, but was the writing of a man who had done something real and wanted her to understand what it was. He had been working with a trades instructor on electrical work, basic to intermediate. He had a certification. He described what the certification meant in terms of actual work available to someone with it, and a clean record once out, and he had clearly researched this carefully. He wrote about the early release. The board meeting had been scheduled. He wrote the date. He wrote what he had been told about the likely outcome, which was cautious and not a certainty but was, from what he could see, positive. He would know within the month. Then he wrote about the children. He asked about Clara's reading, which Rosa had mentioned in her last letter. He asked about Luis and the ranch work, which he had also mentioned. He wrote, about Luis, in a voice that was slightly different from the rest of the letter, more careful, more deliberate, as if he was writing something he needed to get exactly right. He wrote that he was glad Luis had found something to be good at. He wrote that he had been afraid, during the worst of the early months, that the situation would take something from Luis that Luis would not get back. He wrote that knowing it had not, that Luis was working on a ranch and learning to read cattle, and earning the trust of an older man he respected, was the thing that had made the last several months endurable. Rosa had to put the letter down at that point. She put it down and looked out the window at the white fields and the bare tree line and the pale February sky. She sat like that for a while. Then she picked the letter back up. The last 2 pages were the hardest, not because they were painful in the way the first letter had been painful, but because they were honest in a way that asked something of her. He wrote that he did not know what she wanted. He wrote that he would not assume. He wrote that he had spent 8 months trying to become a version of himself that was worth coming back to, and he did not know if he had succeeded, and he would not ask her to decide anything based on an idea of who he might be. He wrote that when he came out, if she was willing, he would like to see the children. He wrote that whatever else was between them, whatever else needed to be worked out or could not be worked out, the children were his children, and he was their father, and that part, at least, he wanted to ask for. He signed it Eduardo. Not love, Eduardo, which is how he had signed the first letters. Just Eduardo. She understood the choice. He was giving her room to decide what the signature was followed by. Rosa sat at the kitchen table for a long time after she finished reading. She read it again, the last 2 pages, more slowly. Then she folded it back into the envelope and put the envelope in the pocket of her coat and went outside. She did not go to the stable. She walked instead across the south pasture, through the snow, following the fence line they had repaired together in November, she and Dale, post by post and wire by wire. She walked it slowly, her breath coming in clouds around her, the snow deep enough in places to come over her boot tops, and she thought about Eduardo, and about the fence, and about what it meant to repair something that had been broken, whether the repaired thing was the same thing it had been before, or whether it was something new that occupied the same space. She thought about her grandfather, who had kept cattle for 40 years, and who said, when something needed fixing on the farm, that you didn't grieve the broken state. You just fixed what needed fixing and got back to the work. He had said this about machines and about fences, and about the time the main barn roof came down in a storm, and about the time one of his hands left without notice during the harvest season. He had applied it broadly, her grandfather, as a philosophy. Rosa had always thought it was wisdom with a limitation, because some things that broke were not machines or barns, and the fixing of them required more than tools and effort. It required the agreement of more than one person. It required willingness on both sides. She stood at the far end of the south pasture where the fence turned toward the north boundary, looking out over the white fields. She could see the main house from here, and the stable, and the cottage roof. She could see the smoke rising from the cottage chimney. She had left the stove burning low when she went out. She thought about what she wanted. This was the question she had told Margaret she did not know the answer to, that night on the porch in December. She was not certain she knew it now, But she knew something she had not known then, something that had developed in the months of work and cold mornings and Bee on Copper's fence and Luis with the cattle, and Clara at the kitchen table after school with her fractions and her birds. She knew that she was not the same person who had driven north on Thanksgiving morning in a van with a flat tire and no clear destination. She was someone who had built something. She was someone who had done work she was good at, in a place that had made room for her and her children, and she had done it well, and the doing of it had changed the shape of what was possible. Whatever came next with Eduardo, she would not approach it from the position of someone who had nothing. She would approach it from here. She walked back to the cottage. That evening, after the children were in bed, she sat at the kitchen table and wrote back to Eduardo. She wrote with the focus and care that she gave to things that mattered, choosing words the way she chose tools, for what they would actually do. She did not write 8 pages. She wrote 4. She told him she had read his letter twice. She told him about the children in the same way she always did, with the specific details that meant she was paying attention. Clara had finished the book about bird migration and had moved on to one about soil composition, which had surprised Rosa, but which Helen Briggs had recommended, and which Clara found, apparently, completely compelling. Luis had been given the responsibility of the morning cattle check without oversight for the past 2 weeks, and he had not missed an animal and had, once, identified a slight swelling in one of the younger cow's back legs before anyone else, and reported it to Dale, who had confirmed it was early joint trouble, and treated it early. And Dale had told Luis directly that he had done well. She wrote that Bee had learned to say the name Copper with the particular rolling emphasis of a 4-year-old who has decided that a word is important and wants everyone to know that she knows it. Then she wrote that she had received the letter about the board meeting and the possible date. She wrote that she was glad about the electrical certification, that it was real and useful, and that she could see he had worked for it. She wrote that she had not yet made decisions about what came next between them, and that she thought honesty about that was better than a false certainty in either direction. She wrote that when the time came and he was out, yes, she wanted him to see the children, and the children needed to see him, and she would arrange it in whatever way was best for them. And she wrote that beyond that she needed more time, not to punish him but because she was still, herself, in the middle of becoming something, and she owed it to herself and to him to wait until she could see it clearly, before she said what she believed. She signed it Rosa. She sealed the envelope. She put it on the table to mail in the morning. She sat for a moment in the quiet kitchen, the stove warm behind her, the dark fields outside the window, the children sleeping in the back rooms. She thought about what it meant to be in the middle of becoming something. She thought about how it was not a comfortable place to be, the middle of it, but that it was an honest place, and that honest places, however uncomfortable, were the only ones that eventually led somewhere real. She got up and put out the kitchen light and went to bed. Outside the cottage, the Montana night settled into its deep winter silence. The snow in the fields held the moonlight faintly. The cattle in the pasture stood in their compact group, warm against each other and unbothered by the cold. Copper and Abe breathed slow in the stable. The smoke from the cottage chimney rose straight up into the still air, a thin gray line against the dark, and then dispersed into nothing, and everything was quiet. The weeks that followed the letter were not dramatically different from the weeks before it. That was one of the things Rosa had not expected about this period of her life, that the most significant things happening inside her were largely invisible on the outside. She went to the stable every morning. She did the feeding. She broke the ice on the stock tank. She checked the cattle. She drove the children to school and picked them up and made dinner, and helped with homework and read with Bee, and talked with Clara, and answered Luis's questions about what they were going to do in the spring when the calves were born. None of this changed because Eduardo's letter was in the pocket of her coat. But she thought about it differently. The letter had clarified something, not in the sense of making a decision, but in the sense of making the dimensions of the situation more visible. She knew what he was asking. She knew what she was not yet ready to give. And she knew that both of those things could coexist without one of them being wrong, which was a form of clarity she had not had before. She talked about it once more with Margaret, briefly, on a morning in late February when the weather had been particularly harsh and they had both ended up in the main kitchen after the morning feeding with cold hands, and an hour before anything else needed to be done. Margaret made tea. They sat. Rosa told her about the board meeting date and the likely outcome. Margaret listened. Then she said, "Are you afraid?" Rosa thought about this carefully. "Not of him," she said. "Not of Eduardo. Of how I feel when I see him. Of whether I will know what to do with that." "You will figure it out when you see him," Margaret said. "That is not a comforting answer," Rosa said. "No," Margaret said, "but it's the true one." She poured more tea. "You have figured out everything else as you went. The stable, The cattle. The calving. The children's school. All of it, you figured out as you went. This is no different. Rosa looked at her. This is considerably different, she said. In scale, Margaret said. Not in method. She picked up her cup. The method is the same. You arrive. You look at what is in front of you. You do what needs doing. Rosa sat with this. The wind moved outside, the particular winter wind that came down off the mountains in late February, hard and purposeful. The horses in the stable would be restless in this kind of wind. She would need to check on them after tea. Nathan is coming this weekend, Margaret said, shifting into the practical, the way she did when a conversation had reached its natural end, and what was needed now was motion. He's bringing someone, a woman he's been seeing. I thought you should know in case you see a strange car on Saturday. Rosa looked at her. Dale knows, she said. Dale knows she exists, Margaret said. He does not yet know she is coming to dinner. I will tell him tonight. She said this with the serene confidence of a woman who has managed a taciturn husband for 39 years, and has developed a precise understanding of what information to provide when. How does Nathan seem? Rosa said. Happy, Margaret said, with a kind of careful, one-word delivery that meant it was both true and new, and she was still getting used to it. He seems happy. Rosa nodded. She thought about Nathan, who she had come to know over the months, who came for dinner approximately twice a month, and who was quiet in the way his father was quiet, but with a different quality to it. Less settled, more searching. Happy was a word Rosa had not associated with Nathan before Margaret said it. It fit well. She finished her tea and went back out to check on the horses. The wind came at her across the drive, and she leaned into it with the ease of someone who had been doing this for months, who knew the land now by its weather as much as by its geography. She pulled the stable door open and stepped inside. Copper turned her head. Abe remained in his corner, specifically aggrieved today, which Rosa had learned to distinguish from his general ambient aggrievance by the angle of his ears. She checked them both. She added hay. She checked the water. She talked to Copper quietly, not because the horse needed conversation, but because Rosa had developed the habit, that particular stable intimacy of a person who spends enough mornings with animals to start simply talking to them the way you talk to someone you trust to listen without judgment. She told Copper about the letter. She told her about Eduardo and the board meeting, and the electrical certification, and the chickens. Copper regarded her with the patient, liquid attention of horses. She did not have opinions about any of it, which was restful. Outside the wind went on. Inside the stable it was warm, and smelled of hay and horses and the ordinary morning, and Rosa finished her checks and went back out into the cold and walked back across the drive toward the cottage, where she would make the children's lunches and start the truck's engine to warm it for the school run and continue the day. March arrived. The days got longer. The ice on the stock tank got thinner. One morning she broke it with a single strike, and looked at the pieces floating in the water and thought, spring is coming, and felt something in her chest that was not quite hope, but was very close to it. She wrote Eduardo a fourth letter. It was shorter than the others. She told him about the calving that was about to start, about Abe's increasing a grievance at his hay placement, about B, who had recently begun conducting long one-sided conversations with Copper through the fence, as though they were discussing things of mutual importance. She told him she was glad about the board meeting. She told him she had been thinking about what he had written, about possibility, and about time. She wrote that she was not yet ready to say everything she thought, but that she would be, and that she wanted him to know she was thinking about it, and that thinking about it was not the same as deciding against it. She signed it Rosa. She sealed the envelope. She put it on the table to mail in the morning, and then she went to make dinner, and the kitchen filled with the smell of something cooking, and Luis came in from outside with dirt on his boots and a story about something one of the calves had done, and Clara sat at the table with her homework, and Bia ran in from the bedroom holding a drawing she had made of a horse that was recognizably Copper in the way that 4-year-old drawings are recognizable, more by intention than by resemblance. And Rosa looked at all of this and felt it land in her the way real things land, with weight and warmth and no particular instruction about what to do next. She did not need instruction. She knew what to do next. She would feed her children and help with the homework and read the bedtime story and then sit at the kitchen table in the quiet after they were asleep, and she would let herself be where she was, in this particular life, on this particular ranch, in this particular winter that was almost spring, and she would let it be enough. Because it was enough. That was the thing she had learned that she had not known she needed to learn. It was enough. The present moment, with all its uncertainty and incompleteness, with its unanswered letters and unresolved futures and questions that would need time, was enough. She was not waiting for something to begin. She was already in the middle of it. She had been in the middle of it since the morning she walked into a stable in the dark and found a place to put her children down in the hay. Everything since then had been the story unfolding exactly as it was supposed to, which did not mean it was easy or that it went in a straight line, but which meant it was real, and real was the only kind of thing worth having. Spring came slowly and then, as spring always does in Montana, all at once. It arrived first as a change in the quality of light, not in the temperature but in the angle and duration of sun, the days stretching at both ends, the mornings arriving earlier with a different character to them, less like resuming something than like beginning it. The snow in the pastures pulled back from the south-facing slopes first, revealing the gray-brown grass underneath, pressed flat by the weight of months, already beginning to stir. Then the stock tank stopped freezing overnight. Then the mud came. The mud was serious. Rosa had not been prepared for the specific quality of Montana spring mud, which was not the light surface kind that dried by midday, but a deep, bottomless variety that sucked at boots and required the tractor path to be regraded and made every task that involved moving between buildings take twice the concentration it needed in other seasons. She had read about spring mud before coming north, the way you read about things in a general way, but reading about it and walking through it in the gray morning while carrying feed buckets were two completely different kinds of knowing. Dale watched her navigate the first really bad mud morning with the particular expression he wore when things were happening according to his expectations. "Gets better by April," he said. "It is April," Rosa said. "Late April," he said. The cattle had begun calving in the third week of March. This was the work Rosa had known was coming, that Dale had mentioned when he first described the position, the night checks and the early mornings, and the careful attention to signs that a cow was approaching labor. She had done calving work before, on her grandfather's farm, but smaller scale. Dale had 14 head and the timing was compressed, several of the cows due within days of each other, which meant 2 weeks of broken sleep and constant monitoring, and the specific focused alertness that calving season demands. Dale did the night checks until Rosa told him she would do every other one. He looked at her. "I'm here," Rosa said. "That's why I'm here." He looked at her for another moment, then he said, "Second alarm is at 2. And gave her the ranch phone with the calving monitor app already set up. Those 2 weeks were unlike anything else she had experienced on the ranch. The days were already full. The nights were punctuated by alarms and the walk across the mud to the calving barn in the dark, and sometimes there was nothing to see and she went back to bed, and sometimes there was a birth already underway and she was there to watch and assist if needed, and once there was a calf that was not breathing when it arrived and she did what she had learned from her grandfather, rubbing the calf's chest hard with both hands and clearing its airway and working at it in the hay with single-minded focus until it drew its first rattling breath and then its second, more confident one, and she sat back on her heels in the hay and let the exhaustion of the moment settle into her shoulders. She did not wake Dale for that one. She did not need to. She handled it and she noted it in the log. And in the morning Dale read the entry and looked at it for a moment, and then looked at her across the kitchen and said, "Good work." "Thank you," she said. He poured his coffee and went outside, which was how he ended conversations that were complete. By the time the calving was finished, 12 calves born and 11 surviving, all of them gaining weight on their mothers and out in the pasture in the strengthening spring sun, something had shifted on the ranch. Rosa felt it but could not have named it exactly. It was not that she had proved something, because she had not been trying to prove anything. It was more that a certain quality of uncertainty had dissolved, something that had been present in the first months even when everything was going well. A provisional feeling, as if the arrangement were still being tested. After the calving season it was simply the arrangement. She was the one who did the morning feeding and the night checks and the fence work and the cattle monitoring, and Dale was the one who managed the larger picture of the operation, and this division had settled into something that worked, that had its own internal logic, and neither of them had to think about it anymore. Greg noticed. He came out one morning in mid-April to help with a piece of equipment that needed 2 people to move. And afterward he stood in the equipment shed doorway with his coffee and said to Rosa, "Dad looks better." "What do you mean?" Rosa said. "Since you got here," Greg said. "He was running this place alone for 2 years. He doesn't say so, but that wears on him. He's not young." He sipped his coffee. "He looks like a man who has help again." Rosa thought about Dale, who came in for coffee at the workbench in the mornings, and talked about the north pasture, who nodded once when she reported something done, who had shown her how to operate the tractor, and then gotten out of the way and let her operate it. She thought about what it had meant, in the hardest months of her own life, to have someone simply be present without making a performance of the being present. "I'm glad," she said. "I'm glad it helps." In April, A second letter arrived from Eduardo. The board had met. The early release had been approved. The date was confirmed. He was coming out in the third week of June. Rosa read this letter at the kitchen table on a Wednesday morning, and then sat for a while, and then got up and did the afternoon feeding and thought about it while she worked, because physical work had always been the place where she did her best thinking, where the body occupied itself and left the mind alone to do what it needed to do. She had spent the winter and spring in a complicated relationship with the idea of Eduardo's return. She had thought about it while she was on the tractor. She had thought about it during the long night walks to the calving barn. She had held it alongside everything else she was doing, not as a problem but as a question, open and ongoing. She had kept writing to him, shorter letters, more factual, the letters you write when you are not yet sure what you are writing toward. He had kept writing to her, careful and consistent, not asking for anything beyond what she offered, which was in itself a thing she noted. June arrived and the grass was up and the calves were running in the pasture and the days were long enough now that the sunset lasted until 9 o'clock and the sky above the hills went through half a dozen shades of orange and pink before it finally went dark. The Harmon Ranch in early summer was a different world from the Harmon Ranch in November, warm and alive and expansive, the fields no longer white and compressed but green and open. On a Thursday evening in the second week of June, Rosa was on the cottage porch after dinner, Clara reading inside, Luis in the yard with a basketball that he had been improving with dramatically over the past several months, B asleep already. The evening was warm for Montana and smelled of grass and the particular clean air of high elevation in summer. Dale came across the drive from the main house. He sat down in the chair beside her on the porch without being invited and without preamble, which was, she had come to understand, his form of comfort, the absence of social ceremony between them. Eduardo comes out next week, Rosa said. She had told him the update when it arrived in April, but she was saying it again now because it was close. I know, Dale said. You mentioned it. I am going to meet him in Billings, she said, to talk, to see where we are. All right, Dale said. Karen said she would watch the children for a day. Karen's good at that, Dale said. Rosa looked at the yard where Luis was perfecting something with the basketball, a move that required a very specific footwork sequence that he had been refining for 2 weeks. I don't know what's going to happen, she said. I want to be honest about that. I don't know what we are going to decide. No reason you would know yet, Dale said. Rosa looked at him. If he comes here, she said, if we decide that's what we want, I want you to know that I will talk to you first. You deserve that. Dale was quiet for a moment. He had his coffee mug in his hands, the evening cup that he always had on the porch, decaf that Margaret made and that he drank without acknowledging was decaf, which was a small domestic arrangement that Rosa found privately very endearing. He looked at the yard where Luis was working through his basketball move. Rosa, Dale said. Yes, she said. This is your home, he said. That's the first thing. He paused. The second thing is that a man who serves his time and comes out and wants to see his children and be present for his family is, in my experience, not someone to close a door on. He looked at the yard. The third thing is that Luis needs his father. Rosa said nothing for a moment. The evening light was golden and long across the grass. Luis completed the footwork sequence and looked up to see if anyone was watching, and Rosa raised her hand slightly from the arm of her chair, just a small gesture, and Luis grinned and reset to try it again. He will like you, Rosa said. Maybe, Dale said. We'll see. They sat on the porch until the sun finally finished going down and the first stars appeared over the hills to the east, and Luis came inside for the night, and the yard was empty, and the Harmon Ranch settled into the quiet of a summer evening, warm and still and full of the particular peace of a place where the day's work has been done well. Nathan's girlfriend turned out to be a woman named Alice, a high school librarian from Billings who had sandy hair and a laugh that arrived quickly and meant it, and who had, within the first 15 minutes of arriving at the Harmon table, identified Clara as a serious reader and begun talking to her about it, with a specificity and enthusiasm that made Clara sit up straighter and talk back, in a way she rarely did with new adults. Rosa watched this from across the table and felt the particular gratitude of a parent who has watched their child be recognized and valued by someone who had no obligation to do it. Dale regarded Alice from his end of the table, with the assessment gaze he applied to new things on his property, careful and unhurried. Alice appeared to be aware of this, and to find it more interesting than intimidating. At one point she asked him directly what he thought about a particular question Rosa had raised about whether to rotate the south pasture next spring, and Dale looked slightly surprised to be consulted, and then considered the question and gave a complete and thoughtful answer, which seemed to satisfy Alice and which definitely satisfied Rosa, who had been wanting to discuss the rotation question for a week, but had been waiting for the right moment. Nathan watched all of this from his seat beside Alice with the slightly stunned expression of a man who has brought someone home and is discovering that they are fitting in considerably better than he had prepared himself to expect. He and Rosa had talked once, briefly, about Eduardo, because Nathan was the kind of person who would rather ask a direct question than wonder. He had asked her one evening when he came for dinner and the children were in bed, sitting at the kitchen table with Greg and Karen and Rosa after a dinner that Margaret had hosted and Dale had eaten and then excused himself from with characteristic efficiency. Nathan had said, "Is it complicated, with Eduardo coming back?" "Yes," Rosa said. "Do you want advice?" he said. "No," she said. "Good," he said. "I don't have any." He had poured more coffee for both of them. "But I think it will be okay." "Why?" she said. Nathan thought about it. "Because of the way you operate," he said. "You don't leave things broken that you can fix, and you don't pretend things are fixed that aren't." He paused. "That's a useful combination." Rosa had thought about this more than once since he said it. She had turned it over in the quiet mornings before the feeding and in the evenings after the children were down. She did not know if it was true of her in all things, but she thought it was true of her in this thing, and that was enough to be going on with. The calving season ended in early April with the 11 survivors in the pasture and the exhaustion in Rosa's body distributed in the specific way that hard work distributes it, not debilitating but pervasive. A deep tiredness in her shoulders and her back and her feet that responded to sleep but was still present in the mornings when she woke, ready to begin again. She had been awake on and off for 2 weeks for the night checks, and her body had adapted to the pattern the way bodies adapt to hard patterns, by doing what was required and adding the cost to a running account to be settled when the season changed. When the last calf was born and healthy and on its feet, Rosa went to the main house and told Margaret, who said good, and gave her a mug of coffee and let her sit at the kitchen table, without anything being required of her for a full half hour, which was Margaret's particular form of recovery prescription, and which Rosa had come to understand was as well calibrated as everything else Margaret did. In late April, the south pasture was green. The cattle moved through it in the morning sun and the calves followed their mothers with the unsteady enthusiasm of young things that do not yet fully trust their own legs but are extremely committed to trying. Rosa stood at the fence and watched them for a while after the morning feeding, her coffee mug warming her hands, the April sun thin but real on her face. Greg came up beside her. He had driven out to help with an equipment check that Dale wanted 2 people for, and he had done it, and now he was also standing at the pasture fence looking at the calves. "Good season," Greg said. 11 out of 12, Rosa said. "That's a good number," Greg said. "Some years are worse." He paused. "You did the calving checks yourself, mostly. Dad told me." "We split them," Rosa said. "He told me you took more than half," Greg said, without accusation, simply reporting. "He said you didn't need to be checked." Rosa looked at the pasture. "He told me you were supposed to fix the water heater in January," she said. Greg winced. "That's fair," he said. Rosa almost smiled. She looked at the calves in the green pasture, at the cows moving through the morning light, at the wide sky over the hills. She thought about how she had come here in the dark and the cold on a morning that felt like a dead end, and had turned out to be, in ways she still did not fully understand, the opposite of that. "Greg," she said. "Yeah," he said. "Thank you," she said, "for the water heater. And for everything else." Greg looked at her. He was quiet for a moment in the way that the Harmons were sometimes quiet, not from lack of feeling but from the particular difficulty of expressing it without diminishing it. Then he said, "You belong here, Rosa, that's all. You just belong here." She looked at the pasture. She did not say anything. The morning continued. She drove to Billings on a Thursday, leaving before the children were awake, taking the long road east through the pale morning because the short route added an hour in construction and she wanted the drive to think. She had told the children the night before where she was going. Clara had listened with the particular attention she brought to information that she was also trying to feel out, both hearing the words and watching her mother's face at the same time to see what else was there. Louise had asked 3 questions in rapid succession, 2 of them practical and 1 of them personal. Bea had asked if she was going to bring snacks for the drive, and Rosa had said yes, and that had been enough for Bea. The drive east was empty and beautiful in the early morning, the hills rolling away on both sides of the road under a sky that was clear from edge to edge, and already turning from pale gray to the warm gold of a June day that was going to be hot by noon. Rosa drove and did not play music, which she almost never did on long drives because she thought better without it. She thought about the things she had decided and the things she had not decided. She thought about what she would say when she first saw Eduardo, and whether there was anything useful to plan about that or whether it would simply have to happen as it happened, which was her instinct. Some things could not be prepared for. Some things required you to be present and to let the moment tell you what it contained. Eduardo was standing outside the coffee shop where they had agreed to meet. She saw him before he saw her. A moment of observation that she had not entirely planned on, but that she was grateful for, because it gave her a second to absorb the fact of him before she had to manage any expression or any words. He was thinner than she remembered, and he had the careful posture of someone who has spent a long time in an institutional setting and has not yet fully relaxed out of it, a slight held quality to his shoulders and his jaw. He was wearing a gray jacket that was slightly too large, and jeans that were new. She could see the fold lines from where they had been packed. He had a paper cup of coffee in his hand that he was not drinking, just holding, and he was looking at the door of the coffee shop with the expression of a man who has decided that standing outside is preferable to going in before she arrives because it gives him something to do with his eyes. She parked the van and got out. He saw her when she was halfway across the parking lot. His expression moved, something running through it too fast to name, and then it settled into something that was not quite neutral and not quite composed but was an honest face trying to be both. He did not move toward her. He waited. She reached him and stopped. "Hi," she said. "Hi," Eduardo said. They stood for a moment. 8 months was not a long time, in one sense. In another sense, it was everything. She could see both of those truths in his face, and knew he could see them in hers. "You look well," he said. "You look like you've been outside." "I have been outside," she said. "Every morning for 7 months." He almost smiled. "How's the van?" "Fixed," she said. "The front right tire, fixed. The water heater at the cottage, also fixed. Several hundred feet of fence, also fixed. It's been a productive winter." "I read about the fence in your letter," he said. "And the calving. And the cattle eye thing with Luis." He paused. "And the chickens that you do not have." She looked at him. "Why are you bringing up chickens?" "Because in your third letter, you mentioned that the ranch did not have chickens," he said. "And I remembered about the chickens. And I thought that was probably important information for me at some point." She did look at him, fully, at his face with its 8 months of something she had not been present for, and at his jacket that was slightly too large, and at the coffee he had not drunk. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Come inside. It's warm out here." They went inside. They sat at a table near the window. The coffee shop was quiet and clean and smelled like good coffee and the ordinary morning activity of a normal day in a normal city. Rosa ordered coffee. Eduardo ordered more coffee, having apparently been standing outside with the first one as a prop rather than actually drinking it. They talked for 4 hours. It was not the conversation Rosa had prepared for, because the conversation she had prepared for was a negotiation, careful and bounded, with clear terms on each side. This was not that. This was two people who had known each other for 11 years talking carefully and honestly about what had happened and what they were, and it was difficult in the places she had expected it to be difficult and surprising in the places she had not. He told her about the program. He described the electrical work the way he had described it in the letter but now with his hands available, and he talked with them the way he always had, using them to clarify things that words got close to but did not quite reach. He had a precision about how things worked, about systems and wiring and what happened when current moved through a connection, and listening to him talk about it was like watching a person inhabit the part of themselves that is most naturally their own. She told him about the ranch. She described Dale and Margaret in ways that the letters had sketched but not filled in. She described the morning work and the calving season and the mud and the snow and the foreman's cottage with its wood stove and the 2 bedrooms and the map of Montana on the wall. She described Luis with the cattle and Clara with her books and Bea with copper and the grass on Bea's open palm. Eduardo was quiet for a while after she finished describing the children. He held his coffee mug with both hands and looked at the table. "I have missed so much of it," he said. "Yes," she said. "I am not asking you to pretend that didn't happen." "I know," she said. He looked up. "What I am asking," he said, "is whether there is a way forward. Not a quick way, not an easy way. A real way. With the children first, because that is the most important thing. And then, if it becomes something you believe in, with you and me." He paused. "I am not asking you to decide that today. I am asking if it is possible." Rosa looked at him. She thought about the question of what she wanted versus what was good, and about Margaret saying those are often different things. She thought about Dale on the porch saying a man who comes out and wants to be present for his family is not someone to close a door on. She thought about Luis and the cattle eye and the things Eduardo had said to his 4-year-old son that the child had kept in a careful mental drawer and brought out when they were relevant. She thought about the fence, about what it meant to repair something broken. She had been thinking about the fence since February, in one way or another, since the morning she had walked it in the snow. "It is possible," she said. Eduardo looked at her. He did not say anything. "I am not saying it will be easy," she said. "I am not saying I have everything worked out. I am saying that the door is open. The rest we will figure out as we go." He exhaled slowly. It was not dramatic. It was just the sound of a man who has been holding his breath for longer than he realized. "Can I see the children soon?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I will take them to you. Or you can come to us, either way." "To Montana?" he said. "To Montana," she said. He sat with this for a moment. "A ranch," he said. "A ranch," she said. "With a horse named Copper. And one named Abe who is very particular about where his hay is placed." Eduardo almost smiled again, and this time it completed. It was the same sideways smile she knew, the one that appeared when something struck him as exactly the right degree of absurd or tender or both at once. She had not seen it in 8 months, and it was, she discovered, still entirely recognizable, as if it had not changed in the least and she had simply been waiting in a place where it wasn't present yet. They left the coffee shop at 1 in the afternoon. In the parking lot, standing beside the van in the warm summer sun, Eduardo said, "Thank you for coming." "I was going to come," she said. "There was no question of that." He looked at her. "I know," he said, "but thank you anyway." She drove home in the long summer afternoon with the windows down and the warm air moving through the van and the radio on. Country music from a billing station that faded after 40 miles, and was replaced by static, and then by a different station, and then by silence that she was comfortable in. The hills rolled by, the sky was wide and clear, the road ran straight and then curved and then straight again, the way Montana roads do, as if they can't quite commit to one direction but are trying their best. She was back at the ranch by 6. Karen had fed the children dinner, and they were in the yard when she pulled in, Luis and Sam in the middle of something that involved a stick and an explanation, and Lily and Bea watching from a safe distance, and Clara sitting on the porch steps reading with the same focused peace she brought to all reading. Clara looked up when the van stopped. She looked at Rosa's face. "How was it?" she said. "It was good," Rosa said. Clara nodded. Then she looked back at her book, which meant she had absorbed the information and accepted it, and filed it away, and would return to it later when she needed to, which was Clara's way of dealing with things that mattered. Rosa came up the porch steps and sat beside her. "He is going to come and see you," Rosa said. Clara looked up again. Her eyes were careful and direct. "When?" she said. "We are working that out," Rosa said. "Soon." Clara nodded again. She looked at Luis in the yard with Sam. "Luis doesn't know yet," she said. "I know," Rosa said. "I will tell him at dinner." "He is going to be very loud about it," Clara said. This was an accurate prediction delivered entirely without malice. It was simply Clara reporting what she understood about her brother. "I know," Rosa said. Clara went back to her book. Rosa sat beside her on the steps and watched Luis and Sam and Lily and Bea in the yard, and the summer evening light moved across the grass, and the roof of the cottage caught the last of the sun, and Dale's truck was in the equipment shed, and the smoke from Margaret's stove was rising from the main house chimney, because even in summer, Margaret started dinner early. Dale himself appeared from somewhere on the property at about 6:30, as he often did at that hour, heading back toward the main house. He saw Rosa on the cottage steps and raised one hand in his characteristic brief way, an acknowledgement without ceremony. Rosa raised her hand back. He went inside. Rosa sat on the steps until it was time to call Luis and Bea in for the night, and then she called them, and they came. The weeks between that Saturday and the second visit were not long weeks. They were full ones. Eduardo had driven back to Billings on Sunday evening, and he and Rosa had talked on the phone twice in the following 10 days, short calls, practical in the way that early conversations are practical, when there is a lot underneath them that is not yet ready to come up. He had found a room in a shared house near Billings, within reach of work opportunities, and he had already had 2 conversations with electrical contractors in the area, who were interested in someone with his certification. He reported this in the direct way he had, not dramatizing it, just telling her what was true. Rosa listened to these calls in the cottage kitchen after the children were asleep, sitting at the table in the low light with her tea, and she listened for what was underneath the practical information, which was his steadiness. This was what she was listening for, and what she found: a consistency across the weeks, the same calm effort in the second call that had been present in the first, the same lack of pressure, The same absence of asking her for anything beyond what she offered. It was not excitement, which some people might have found insufficient. Rosa did not find it insufficient. She found it more convincing than excitement would have been, because excitement was a mood, and moods changed, and what she was listening for was something more structural. Eduardo came back on a second Saturday 3 weeks later. This time he came by his own means, having borrowed a car from one of his housemates, and arrived mid-morning when the children were already up and ready and slightly over-ready, Luis vibrating with an energy he had not been able to fully manage since breakfast, Clara in the clothes she had chosen carefully, and tried not to admit she had chosen carefully, Bia standing in the yard holding a piece of grass from the fence to give to Copper, but who had been redirected at breakfast to understand that you could give it to Eduardo first if you wanted, and then to Copper, and who was now holding the grass and watching the drive. When Eduardo's car appeared at the top of the drive, Bea looked at the car and then looked at Rosa and said, "Is that him?" "That's him," Rosa said. Bea looked at the grass in her hand. She had a brief internal conference that was entirely visible on her face. Then she walked to the car as it stopped, and when Eduardo got out she held up the grass to him. Eduardo crouched down and looked at the grass. "What's this for?" he said. "For Copper," Bea said. "But you can give it to her if you want." Eduardo took the grass very carefully, as if it were something significant, which in Bea's economy it was. "Thank you," he said. "Should we go now?" "After you say hi to Mama," Bea said. Eduardo looked up at Rosa over Bea's head. Rosa was already looking at him. "Hi," he said. "Hi," she said. "Come inside first." They went inside. This second visit had a different quality from the first. The first visit had been an arrival, with all the weight of everything it stood for. The 8 months, the letters, the long drive to Billings, the conversation over 4 hours of coffee. The second visit was something else. It was, more than anything, ordinary. Eduardo helped Luis with a drainage issue he had been digging at behind the cottage, a small channel that needed to redirect water away from the foundation when the snow melted. They spent an hour at this together, Luis explaining his system and Eduardo helping him improve it without taking it over, and Rosa watched from the kitchen window and thought about what Dale had said about the eye, about some things being found rather than taught. Clara showed Eduardo her school project, a detailed map of Montana's river systems, labeled in Clara's precise handwriting with historical notes in the margins. Eduardo spent 20 minutes with it, asking questions that were specific enough that Clara had to think before she answered, which was Clara's version of being impressed. She showed him where the ranch was on the map and where the school was, and where Billings was, tracing the distance with her finger. "That is a long drive for a second visit," Eduardo said. "It was not too long," Clara said. Eduardo looked at her. "No," he said. "It was not." In the afternoon, when the children had dispersed to various parts of the property and the cottage, Rosa and Eduardo sat on the porch with coffee in the warm August afternoon, and talked for a while and then sat in silence for a while. The silence that comes between people when they have known each other for long enough that silence does not require filling. The hills were green and far, and the cattle were visible as small dark shapes moving slowly in the south pasture. A hawk circled somewhere above the tree line, patient and slow, riding the thermal. "I want to come more often," Eduardo said. "I know," she said. "Is that all right?" he said. She looked at him. She thought about the question she had asked herself for months, about what she wanted versus what was good, and about whether those two things had to be different. She thought about the drive from Billings, 3 hours each way, and about the fact that he had made it twice in 3 weeks without being asked to, without any expectation, simply because he wanted to be here, because these 3 children, and this woman who had built something out of nothing, in a cold stable on a Thanksgiving morning, were the reason he had gotten up every morning for 8 months, and done the hard and unremarkable work of becoming someone worth returning to. "Yes," she said, "it is all right." He nodded. He looked at the pasture. He did not make a speech about it. He picked up his coffee and drank it, and sat with her in the afternoon sun, and they both watched the hawk circle above the tree line, until it angled away to the north and was gone. Inside, through the cottage wall, they could hear Luis explaining something to Bea with a great deal of enthusiasm, and Bea responding with what sounded like a counter-argument. This was their normal mode of operating, and had been since Bea was old enough to have an opinion, which in Bea's case had been early. Rosa and Eduardo listened to it with the particular attention of parents listening to their children through a wall, not to the words exactly but to the quality of the voices, checking by instinct that everything was fine, that the argument was the good kind of argument, which it was. Eduardo smiled. Rosa heard it before she saw it, in the small change his breath made, and she turned and looked at him, and his face was open in a way it had not been on the first visit, less careful, less managed. and she understood that this was what progress looked like between them. Not a declaration, not a resolution, just a face becoming more like itself. The sun moved, the afternoon stretched. The children came back in from wherever they had been, and there was the noise and motion of a household resuming, and Eduardo was in the middle of it in a way that was not forced and not remarkable, just present, the way you are present in a place that has decided to make room for you. Eduardo arrived on a Saturday in late August, which is the best time in Montana by almost anyone's calculation, the days still long and warm, and the light lasting well into the evening, the grass at its fullest green before the autumn begins to take the color back. Rosa picked him up from the bus station in town early that morning, leaving before the children were awake at Karen's request, because Karen had decided that the children should have a normal morning, so that when their father arrived it was into a day already in motion, rather than into a day that had been stopped and held specially for his arrival, which she thought would put too much weight on the moment, and would be harder for everyone. This was the kind of insight that made Karen an excellent third-grade teacher, and also an excellent friend, and Rosa had agreed immediately. She drove him the 7 miles from town in the morning light, and Eduardo sat in the passenger seat of the repaired van, and watched the hills go by, and asked 2 questions about the land, and said nothing further until they turned onto the gravel drive of the Harmon property, and he could see the main house and the stable and the equipment shed, and, at the edge of the drive, the whitewashed cottage with its small yard. He looked at the cottage for a moment. "That's it?" he said. "That's it," Rosa said. "It's a good size," he said. "It has a wood stove," she said, "and a water heater that works now." Eduardo nodded. He was quiet as the van stopped. Then he said, "Rosa." "Yes," she said. "Thank you," he said. "Not for anything specific, for all of it." She looked at him. "Get out of the van," she said. He got out. She got out. They were standing in the gravel drive in the August morning when the cottage door opened and Luis came out. What happened in that first moment would be the thing Rosa thought about most in the days and weeks that followed. Not the words, because there weren't any words immediately. Luis walked across the gravel in his socks, which meant he had run out of the cottage before finishing dressing, and he walked straight to Eduardo, and Eduardo crouched down, and Luis put both arms around his neck, and Eduardo closed both arms around Luis, and they stayed like that for a long moment in the August morning, with the gravel under Luis's sock feet, and the hills green in every direction. Rosa looked somewhere else. She looked at the sky, which was clear and vast and very blue. She stood very still. Clara came out next, fully dressed, in her careful, unhurried way. She crossed the gravel and she stood in front of Eduardo and Luis for a moment after Luis had stepped back, and then she said, "Hi, Dad," in a voice that was trying to be normal and nearly succeeding. Eduardo said hi back. He reached out and put his hand on her shoulder, and she let him. That was Clara's version of the same thing Luis had done, a smaller gesture, because she was older and had more to carry with her, but real. Bea appeared in the cottage doorway, unwilling to leave the threshold because she was not entirely certain about this situation yet. She was 4 years older in appearance now, because 4-year-olds change enormously in 8 months, and Eduardo had been looking at a photograph from last November when he thought about her. He looked at her in the doorway now, this 5-year-old with her hair pulled into a crooked ponytail, and he said, "Bea," and she regarded him for a long moment with the serious, evaluating expression of a small child making a determination. Then she said, "Do you want to meet Copper?" Eduardo looked at Rosa. Rosa looked at Bea. "He would like that," Rosa said. "Okay," Bea said. She came down from the threshold and took Eduardo's hand and led him toward the stable with the focused purpose of someone on a mission, and Eduardo went with her, and Clara and Luis followed, and Rosa stood in the drive and watched them go, and pressed her hands flat against her legs and breathed. Dale came out of the main house at about 9 o'clock. He crossed the drive at his usual measured pace, his coffee mug in hand, and found Eduardo at the stable fence with Bea on one side of him and Luis on the other, watching Copper move in the small morning paddock. Dale stopped beside him and looked at the horse. "Good-looking animal," Eduardo said. "She knows it," Dale said. They stood looking at the horse in silence for a moment. Then Dale turned and looked at Eduardo in his direct, unhurried way, and Eduardo looked back, and whatever assessment was being made on both sides was made in that look without either of them speaking. "I hear you know electrical work," Dale said. "Intermediate level," Eduardo said. "I have a certificate. I have a panel in the equipment shed that's been giving me trouble," Dale said. "I can look at it," Eduardo said. "After breakfast," Dale said. He turned toward the main house. "Margaret made enough for everyone. She always does." He went inside. Eduardo looked at Rosa across the stable fence. His expression was somewhere between surprised and not surprised at all. which was, she was discovering, the appropriate way to look at most things on the Harmon Ranch. They had breakfast in the main house, all of them, around the extended table that Margaret pulled out the leaf for without ceremony, as if this were simply what the table did on Saturday mornings. Margaret had made biscuits, because she had made biscuits on the first morning of any importance since Rosa arrived, and it was apparently her way of marking things. Bea took a biscuit before anyone else had sat down, and Margaret gave her one without comment, and Bea said thank you, which she had been reliably saying since February, and Eduardo looked at his youngest daughter and back at Rosa with an expression that she understood entirely. Eduardo looked at the panel in the equipment shed after breakfast. Dale stood nearby while he worked, not watching closely but present, which was how Dale observed anything. Eduardo found the problem in 20 minutes, a loose connection at the main breaker that had been causing intermittent faults, and he fixed it with tools from Dale's wall, and tested it, and it held. Dale looked at the repaired connection and nodded once. What else needs looking at? Eduardo said. Dale considered this for a moment. Come back Monday, he said. I'll make a list. Eduardo looked at him. He understood the offer the same way Rosa had understood the offer of the cottage 7 months ago, by recognizing that Dale Harmon did not make offers he didn't mean, and did not mean things he didn't say. I'll be here, Eduardo said. The rest of the day passed in the way that important days sometimes do, not in grand moments but in the accumulation of small ordinary ones that are, together, everything. Clara showed Eduardo the map of Montana on the cottage wall, and traced the drive she had made from Arizona with her finger, the approximate route, the long way north. Luis demonstrated the thing with the cattle, showing Eduardo how to read the way an animal was standing and what it might mean, and Eduardo watched with genuine interest. Bea had Copper eat grass from his palm, talking him through it with the patient instruction of someone who has done this many times and knows exactly how flat the hand needs to be. In the afternoon, Rosa found herself in the cottage kitchen, making coffee, and simply standing there for a moment with the window in front of her, showing the yard where Eduardo and Luis were playing some version of basketball that Luis was explaining with a great deal of emphasis, and Eduardo was attempting with reasonable effort and no obvious natural gift. And she watched them, and she let herself watch them without any qualification or reservation, because this was real, and it was happening, and she had worked hard enough for it, that she was allowed to just look at it. The second Thanksgiving at the Harmon table arrived as all Thanksgiving mornings do, in the cold and the dark and the smell of something already cooking from Margaret's kitchen before anyone else was fully awake. The table had the leaf in it again. The chairs were borrowed again from the study and the bedroom. June and Paul and Nathan were there. Greg and Karen and Sam and Lily were there. And at the end of the table, on the side that faced the window, Rosa sat with Eduardo beside her and their 3 children across from them. And it was crowded and warm, and the food was passed in both directions, and Luis talked too loud, and Bea sat in Margaret's lap for part of dinner, because she had decided months ago that this was an option available to her, and she continued to exercise it freely. When Dale stood to say grace, the table went quiet. He bowed his head. He said the same things he always said, about the land and the family and the food and the day. And then, as had become his practice, he added something at the end. We are grateful, he said, for what endures, for what is repaired and stands again, for the people who stay, and the people who come back, and the ones who find their way here in the dark and the cold by paths we would not have thought to plan for them. He paused. May we always have room. He said, Amen. Everyone echoed it. Luis said it a half second after everyone else, because he had been reaching for the rolls at the same time, but he said it. Eduardo looked at Rosa. She looked at him. Under the table, his hand found hers and she let it stay. Dale sat down. Margaret passed the biscuits. The children talked over each other and the adults talked over the children, and the evening came down over the Montana hills in its slow autumn way, the light going from gold to orange to the particular deep blue of a clear November dusk, and the main house glowed from its windows into the dark, and the cattle stood quiet in the pasture, and the horses breathed in the stable, and the foreman's cottage at the edge of the drive showed a light from its window where Bea had left the bedside lamp on, which she always did, a habit she had developed in her first weeks there and had never outgrown. The light in the cottage window, small and steady in the dark. Everything that needed to be said. What came in the weeks after that second Thanksgiving was not the kind of thing that has a single name. It was the continuation of something already in motion, the story going on the way stories go on when they are about real people in real circumstances, without dramatic pivots and without clean endings, just forward movement through the days. Eduardo drove up from Billings 2 or 3 times a month through the fall. The drive was long, but he made it without complaint. And over time the children stopped treating his arrivals as events, and started treating them the way you treat the arrival of someone who comes often, with a glance up from what you are doing and a casual acknowledgement, and then a return to what you were doing, because his presence had become something expected and ordinary, and therefore something that did not require ceremony. This was, Rosa thought, the best possible development. Ordinary was the goal. Ordinary was what she had been trying to build since the morning she walked into the stable and found a warm place for her children. Not extraordinary, not remarkable, just the particular, irreplaceable, desperately undervalued quality of ordinary life, where the days have a shape and the shape holds and the people in it can count on the shape holding. Eduardo's electrical work had developed. A contractor in Billings had taken him on first for a trial period and then for a regular position after the trial, confirmed what Eduardo had suspected about himself, that he was careful and reliable, and that he had a specific patience with complex systems that made him good at the work. He called Rosa one evening in October to tell her that he had been offered a permanent position with benefits, and that the contractor had mentioned, in a passing way, the possibility of eventually expanding his operations toward the central and western part of the state, toward the area around the Harmon Ranch and the town 7 miles away where Clara's school was and Karen taught 3rd grade. Rosa had not said anything immediately when he said this. "I am not making a plan," Eduardo said. "I am just telling you what I heard, in case it was relevant information at some point." "It is relevant information," Rosa said. "All right," he said. "Eduardo," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is relevant information," she said again. And in her voice was something that had not been in her voice the first time she said it, a warmth that she had stopped managing, because managing it had become both exhausting and unnecessary. He was quiet for a moment. "Okay," he said, and his voice was the same. That conversation was in October. By November it had been revisited, more directly, more clearly, and a plan had taken shape that was not yet a certainty but was more concrete than the conversations before it. Eduardo would continue with the Billings position through the winter. The contractor's westward expansion was a real possibility for spring. There were things to be worked out, practical and otherwise. There were conversations still ahead about what it meant to rebuild something, about what rebuilding required from both of them, about what they were asking of each other, and what they were able to give. These conversations happened. They were not easy and they were not brief. They happened on the phone and on the porch of the cottage, and at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, and they were the kind of conversations that take a long time to have, and that cannot be hurried without losing something essential. Rosa and Eduardo were not people who hurried such things. They had learned, separately and together, what hurrying cost. But the conversations happened, and when they were done there was something between them that had not been there before. Not just possibility, which they had had since June, but agreement. A shared picture of a future that was still being built but whose outline they could both see. Dale was the first person Rosa told, one morning in early November while they were at the stable workbench with their coffee before the morning feeding. She told him about Eduardo's work and the possible expansion westward, and what it might mean. Dale listened with his coffee mug in his hands and his eyes on the middle distance in the way he listened to things that required consideration. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The old Miller property is 5 miles north." Rosa looked at him. "What about it?" she said. "Sold 2 years ago," Dale said. "Family from Seattle bought it as a retreat. Don't use it much. Caretaker lives in the main house, but the foreman's cottage there has been empty since they bought it." He paused. "I know the caretaker. His name is Pete Oatley. Good man. He might know if they'd consider a longer rental arrangement for someone with a trades background." Rosa stared at him. Dale met her eyes briefly, then looked back at the middle distance. "I am not trying to get rid of you," he said. "You are not going anywhere. The work here is yours for as long as you want it. I am saying there might be a place for Eduardo that is near here, but is his own place." He picked up his coffee. "A man needs his own ground to stand on." Rosa sat very still for a moment. She thought about Dale Harmon, who had found a woman and 3 children in his stable on a Thanksgiving morning, and had given them a cottage and a job, and a place to belong, without ever making a production of it, without ever asking for anything in return, without ever once making Rosa feel as though she was a problem being managed or a debt being accumulated. She thought about what Carl Briggs had done for him 32 years ago, and about how a person pays that kind of thing forward, not by repaying it, but by doing it again for the next person who needs it. "Dale," she said. "I'll call Pete this week," Dale said. He went out to the stable. Rosa sat at the workbench with her coffee and looked at the stable door he had closed behind him, and felt something she did not have an immediate name for, something that was gratitude and grief and wonder and something else entirely. Some feeling that the English language approaches but does not quite reach. The feeling of being seen completely by someone who is not making anything of the seeing. She finished her coffee. She went out to do the feeding. Christmas that year had snow on the ground and all the Harmon children and grandchildren in the main house, and Eduardo at the table for the first time for a holiday, which was noted by everyone and commented on by no one, because the Harmons were people who absorbed change without announcing their absorption of it. Dale shook Eduardo's hand when he arrived. Eduardo shook his hand back. That was the whole of the formal acknowledgement. The informal one took place over the course of the day, in the equipment shed where Eduardo and Greg looked at a generator problem together and solved it in 20 minutes with a combined satisfaction that Rosa could see through the shed window from where she was bringing water to the horses. In the kitchen where Nathan asked Eduardo a question about house wiring, and Eduardo answered it fully and correctly, and Nathan looked at him with the quiet regard of a man who respects competence. In the living room where Bea climbed into Eduardo's lap at 4 in the afternoon, and fell asleep there the way she fell asleep on people she trusted, completely and without announcement. Dale saw this last one from his chair across the room. He said nothing. He looked at it for a moment. Eduardo with Bea asleep on his lap, Rosa at the kitchen doorway, the house full of people and the smell of food, and the ordinary noise of a family that had room for one more. Then Dale picked up the newspaper he had been pretending to read for an hour and went back to pretending to read it. The cottage window was lit when they drove back across the drive that evening. The lamp Bea had left on, warm and small in the December dark. Eduardo sat for a moment before getting out of the van and looked at it. "Next year," he said. "Next year," Rosa agreed. They got out of the van. A cold came at them, clean and familiar. Rosa pulled her coat tighter. Eduardo came around to her side, and they walked together across the frozen drive toward the cottage, where the children were already ahead of them, Clara opening the door, Luis talking about something at full volume, Bea running for the lamp she had promised not to leave on. The door opened. The light came out. They went in.